there and it gets changed, it's, I think all government boils down to the character of the people that are in office. It's good to have a constitution. It's good to try to hold them to it. But if the individuals have no character, then there's not much hope. People ask about how do you get rid of the influence of the special interests. Well, if we had only men of character and women of character, just ignore the pressures of the special interests. They say, well, we need to pass laws against lobbyists coming to Washington. I said, well, that's not going to do it. But ultimately, if you don't want influence by powerful special interests, whether it's foreign policy or domestic, is you have to make the government completely different. The government should be there, but for one reason, to protect liberty, not to run our lives, run the economy, or police the world. That is the kind of government I advocate.
How did it all start? Almost everyone has heard of the United States Constitution, but how many people who call themselves U.S. citizens really know what the original intent of the founders was? What necessities, what dreams, what intentions led to this magnificent country, the United States of America? How did it all start? And how can so many go about their daily lives with not the slightest concern that it may not go on forever? What is it in human nature that causes people to take for granted the very fundamentals that are responsible for their happy state of affairs? Fundamentals that, if removed, will cause that slow or quick decline experienced by so many once strong nations throughout history. Let's talk to a few citizens and see how much they understand about the document Ben Franklin and the Founding Fathers created at the dawn of this nation.
What is the U.S. Constitution?
It's a documentary that allowed white people who owned property to vote.
The U.S. Constitution is the document that basically outlines our rights as citizens.
It was thought up by Misters Hamilton, Madison, and Jay.
Oh, it's the document basically describing the overall structure of what we consider the laws of our land.
The dictionary defines constitute as follows. All of the definitions in this word point to what a constitution is, but 4 words are repeated 2 or 3 times. These words are form, set, establish, and make.
Well, the word establish actually appears a number of places in the Constitution, but if you're talking about the preamble, we the people of the United States do hereby ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States. It refers to the creation of the government. Ordain is a legal term, essentially means that we, the people, have the power to pass this law, and establishes the actual setting up of something that didn't exist prior to the Constitution being ratified.
The words found and frame are also present, and these words closely parallel the spirit of the repeated words. But if this is what it means to constitute something, what is a constitution?
The U.S. Constitution is the agreement between the people designed, at the founding of this country.
It is the compass that should lead the nation along the path of freedom and liberty for the individual.
The United States Constitution is the supreme law of the land, as it itself says, although it derives, of course, from the Declaration of Independence, which states a set of higher principles, if you will, that guide interpretation of the Constitution.
The Constitution governs the way we live.
She's right.
So let's go over this again. We, the people, established the U.S. government. We established the United States. The people, through a charter, a document called the Constitution, gave birth to this entity we now call the United States of America. This entity is managed by people we now call the government.
We the people means that the people are supposed to be in charge and not the government, and that the powers come from the people. They don't naturally fall to the government in any natural way. They get there because the people grant those powers in a very limited fashion. And once again, I think that's the part that we have forgotten too much, that it seems like it is now that we the people means we the people in Washington who run your life and control your money. And that's where we've gotten off base.
Thus, under the authority of we the people, the Founding Fathers drafted up a set of principles that aligned with the principles in an earlier document known as the Declaration of Independence. The Constitution was thus established upon these combined principles. Today, we the people continue to breathe life into that which was established by our ancestors.
That is to say, the original inhabitants, colonial people who declared their independence from Britain, established this system, and they established it for a certain geographical jurisdiction. So anyone who comes within that geographical jurisdiction has to accept the existence of this set of laws, just as if you come into my home, you may have to accept the customs in my home. If you come into my business, you may have to accept the terms and conditions on which my business is run, so long as there's no superior authority to tell me that I can't do it that way. And of course, there is no superior authority to the Constitution of the United States within our legal system.
The significance of we the people, as it was written into the founding documents of the United States, was that the power of the government was coming from the people being handed to the government, and that the people, we the people, were the supreme authority. They were the source of the sovereignty. They were the ones that were creating the government, and the government was to be subject to their will. That was quite a different experience in the course of history, because prior to that, all governments were the other way around. That the governments were formed by the kings and the conquerors, and then they say, oh yeah, well, by the way, now that we've got ourselves in charge here and we've got everything under control, let's see about the people. Maybe we'll think about the people. What rights are we going to give the people? What benefits will we give the people to keep them from revolting or whatever? But it was always the top down until the United States Constitution was written, and all of a sudden it was from the bottom up. We the people were instituting that government.
That's an interesting flip. The Constitution is a document used to enforce law on government, a document designed to limit government rather than limit citizens, as laws usually do.
The Constitution was written to limit the size and scope of government. It was to recognize that government was there to protect our liberties. The government would be very much smaller. It does not endorse the welfare system at all, and doesn't endorse the idea that we are the policemen of the world and we should occupy other countries. So instead of a government now that occupies so many other countries, and we have 700 bases overseas, that wouldn't happen if we had the proper size government. The government would be much, much smaller. Maybe 80% smaller if we just followed the Constitution.
It's important to realize that the government did not give birth to the United States. We, the people, did. More specifically, our ancestors, when they were we, the people, living at the time, did.
Unfortunately, the system has changed. Every year, incrementally, so slowly, and so in such small little steps that you could hardly see it. The fulcrum has gradually tipped back the other way, and now we have reverted back to the old world style of government, where the government is in charge, and we, the people, are being told what to do by the government. And that's a situation that is very sad in my mind, and it's more than sad, it's very dangerous, and we had better change it, or else we're going to wind up in abject slavery.
Ich proklamiere, die älteste Ostmark des deutschen Volkes soll von jetzt an das jüngste Bollwerk der deutschen Nation und damit des deutschen Reiches
So, what is the U.S. government? What's its job? Its hat?
Gosh, I can't think about what it is. I'm trying to think. I mean, I know what it is, but do you know what the role of the federal government is?
Not really.
It changes according to, your times. The document was written with the idea that the government would be subservient to it.
I believe that it was more outlining a federalist type of structure.
It's pretty well spelled out. All we have to do is read the Federalist Papers.
I think we would get back to the idea of federalism of the states as laboratories, where if you want to make one decision in Manhattan about, pornography and XXX movies, you make it. You want to make another decision in Utah, you make that there. We decide in Virginia. And most laws would be decided at the state level. We would be one nation and one people, but we would have a more diverse country politically, rather than have the politics the federal government imposed upon the nation. And I think you would have a much more peaceful country, because if people didn't like it in New York, they can move to Virginia, or they can move to Utah, they can move to Mississippi, they can move where they're comfortable.
When the Founding Fathers ratified the Constitution, wasn't their intention to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for a common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty, not only for themselves, but for their children as well? Are we doing this?
We're supposed to be the future that pays off everyone's debt.
Well, I'm not paying off everyone's debt. I don't even believe in debt.
You better or you're gonna hell, Pierce.
See, you get all that swearing from TV.
Let's take a look at the issues confronting our country and the world, and see how an application of the Constitution might be able to undo some of the knots we've tied ourselves up in. Values. There's that word again. Like inflation or loss of purchasing power, words and phrases we have heard endlessly. But do we really know what the word values means?
When people use the word values in society, I think generally they're talking about the definition of their culture. What is the predominant religious view? What is their view of justice? Every culture has its own little set of rules and regulations, the ethics of that culture. Many of them overlap, but you'd be surprised as you travel around the world how divergent some of those elements can be. For example, in the United States and in the Western world, the idea of monogamous marriage is it's a value. It's a very important value, but there are parts in the world where a man is entitled, in fact, an obligation to have more than one wife, especially if there's a woman that needs to be provided for. Her husband has died and she's on the street, to take her in as a second wife and so forth. And Americans are horrified at that idea because they're all tied up with this question of sexuality, and they don't realize that in other cultures it's got very little to do with sexuality at all. It has to do with family unit and supporting people in need and so forth. So each culture has its values. That's not to say that we're supposed to have the view that all cultures are equal. I think we're entitled to be biased in this sense. I think most of us, regardless of what culture we're in, we're entitled to think that our culture is the best. But in Western civilization, certainly in the United States, we have a set of values that has served us well and has created a great civilization.
So are values relative or are they absolute? The way this question is answered may determine how much war a nation will tolerate.
Are you saying? Yes. It's relative.
Well, whenever someone tells me that all values are relative, I always ask them, are you absolutely sure of that? I mean, if you don't start from some point, whether you're doing a scientific experiment or you're running a political system, this is the 0 point. This is the cross of the XYZ axis on the graph. You're lost. Now, it may be some of those points are arbitrary. It may be some of those points can't be proven. It may be some of those points really doesn't make a difference whether we pick this one or that one. But you better be sure of where you are before you take the next step.
It seems values have the ability to instill useful ideas into people. Ideas like borrowing money for consumption is wrong, balancing budgets is right, war is wrong. Why is this?
A true nation is a moral community. It shares things in value. It is an extended family. And if they do not share similar values and convictions about what is right and wrong and good and evil, and they're disagreed on these fundaments, it ceases to be a community. And if it's not a community, it's not going to be a real country. And in a crisis, it will come apart.
A great challenge is, why are people good and how are they good? I mean, if we can solve the problem of human virtue, we really solve the problem of statism, of a government itself. The government is intended to solve the problem of evil, fundamentally. And if you count fraud in that category, it's still the same sort of thing. The degree to which we can make people good of their own free choice, of their own free will, is the degree to which we need government less.
Welcome to today's world, a situation that may have started in 1962 with a Supreme Court case of Engel versus Vitale. In this case, it seems the people unwittingly allowed their government to violate the First Amendment, which states, quote, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the exercise thereof," end quote. From this, it's clear. The founders' original intent was for the government to take a neutral position with respect to religion. Government was not to favor anyone's religion or prohibit anyone's religion. For instance, when Engel and others, such as Abington Township v. Schempp and Stone v. Graham, progressively outlawed both prayer and the Ten Commandments from the schools between 1962 and 1980, the Supreme Court may have misinterpreted the Constitution, as it removed just about the only source of values children were getting in the nation's schools at the time. This is not to say that the only source of values is the Ten Commandments. This action seriously invalidated the need for values in civilized society. Thus, is it any wonder there continues to be so much antisocial behavior on school campuses? Behavior many feel is choreographed by the endless parade of Hollywood values?
I'm going to tell the electrician to give it to you slow and easy, wise guy.
And why are so many children coming from broken homes these
Wasted
days?
25 years of my time, and for what?
Could it be because so many children, now parents themselves, are clueless about the values that make a marriage work?
The whole public school movement came out of an anti-American movement in the beginning from Dewey and the others who propagated it. Anti-American in this sense. We say anti the values of the Founding Fathers, because the values of the Founding Fathers and the values of the biblical principles of Jews and Christians is that we should, parents are responsible for the education of their children. Parents, when they're responsible, want them to be filled with faith and values and also knowledge, which has been taken away from them. The public school movement was a socialist movement. It produced children that have become more and more enamored of the state as being their primary source of values, and it's produced a degrading of their, not only their level of wisdom, knowledge, and understanding, but a degrading of their values.
One of the key reasons people flocked to the New World was to be able to practice values through the religion of their choice, or no religion at all, without government prohibition. Unfortunately, the 1980 case of Stone v. Graham symbolized the start of the demise of all values in the public school system when the Ten Commandments were banned. With this event, we, as a society, may have opened the door to a society devoid of all values, whether originating in the Judeo-Christian tradition or any other tradition. We have allowed the Supreme Court to improperly interpret the original intent of the founders when we allowed them to systematically eradicate values from society in the name of diversity and equality.
So what has happened is the Supreme Court has usurped all this power over the states and the people and been imposing its views and values on the states and on the people. But there's a weapon in the Constitution left there by the Founding Fathers, Article 3, Section 2, whereby Congress can tell the Supreme Court, stay out of this area, you have no authority here. It can restrict the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court by simple majority vote of both houses and the signature of the president. But Congress is too cowardly to confront the court, even though it has the power to do it. Not enough Americans are aware of this power, which is right in there. We do have a weapon to deal with the Supreme Court, a legal and constitutional weapon, and it is a dereliction of duty on the part of the Congress and President that they have never used it. It suggests that they are not serious in fighting the culture war.
Abetted by incessant indoctrination from the corporate media, the Hollywood-based U.S. motion picture industry, crops of PhDs, Juris Doctorates, and MDs in academia, it is now politically correct to equate values with religion, and thus treat both as diseases, their practitioners lepers. Again, the founders wanted government to be neutral on the issue of religion. They did not want a society without values or religion.
If you're talking about values relating to the United States Constitution, my experience has been that there is very little taught about the Constitution beyond what I call the mechanistic way it works. How are people elected to Congress? Here's the president, here are the courts, this is what they do. But very little emphasis seems to be laid on the basic principles of the Constitution. Why is it structured this way? What was the purpose that the Founding Fathers had in mind? On what basis did they choose this structure as opposed to other structures? They had a pretty good structure, comparatively speaking, in the English system. And that knowledge of the principles of the Constitution is really what's necessary for people to apply it.
So it seems values are extremely important. After all, if citizens can't differentiate between wise and foolish courses of action, they will fail to act appropriately on such things as energy policy, but also on even more serious issues. For instance, upon what criterion could citizens agree that it was necessary to go to war? Surely a nation full of citizens with no common values would be confused. They may be totally free, but their confusion will make them short-lived, if not barbaric. And many civilizations prior to the United States were barbaric. That's why the American experiment is so important. That's why the rudiments that made America happen must be preserved. Thus, applying and defending the values implied in the Constitution are, in essence, a matter of survival. For if these factors are dropped out, you get a cruel, chaotic, and revengeful society. Such a society will eventually occupy its time with pleasure-seeking hedonism, material acquisition, and violence-oriented pastimes. Hey, welcome to today's United States. No surprise, the baby boomers are in charge now.
The United States has undergone a cultural, moral, and religious revolution. And a militant secularism has arisen in this country. It's always had a hold on the intellectual and academic elites. But in the 1960s, it captured the young in the universities and the colleges, and we had this great battle, cultural war begin then nationally. And since then, if you will, secularism has really achieved dominance in the academic community and the intellectual community and the entertainment community in Hollywood, among part of the political community, but not the nation as a whole. However, it is much stronger than it was, and so this is the basis of the great cultural war we're undergoing right now. And this militant, it is an anti-Christian, anti-God, anti-traditionalist revolution. It's partly the sexual revolution has a lot to do with it and how people live. And so we are two countries now. We are two countries morally and socially and culturally and theologically, and cultural wars do not lend themselves to peaceful coexistence. One side prevails or the other prevails, and the truth is that while the conservatives, in my judgment, we won the Cold War with political and economic communism, we've lost the cultural war with cultural Marxism, which I think has prevailed pretty much in the United States, or is now the dominant culture, whereas those of us who are traditionalists, we are, if you will, the counterculture.
What exactly is cultural Marxism, the dominant culture of today? How did the founders of communism figure out a way to take over our country, not with guns and weapons, but with values and ideas? Let's take a closer look at this and see exactly how it happened. There was a man named Karl Marx. Marx got an idea. His idea was that the workers of the world should unite and rise up to counter an evil foe, that foe being capitalism. Capitalism, the idea that people and private companies should be able to own the means of production and be free to earn and have as much as they wished, was anathema to Marx. Marx felt the state should own the means of production, as well as products produced, and then the state should distribute a fair share of all such products to each and every worker. Thus, in his book, The Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx thundered, "Workers of the world, unite!" Sure that he had a principle to unify all workers in every country, Marx looked forward to eventually taking over the world.
Karl Marx believed that you would have a rebellion by the workers against the capitalist system, which would then create a Marxist communist society where you would have dictatorship of the proletariat.
Unfortunately, when World War I broke out, the workers of the world did not unite. In fact, the workers united with their respective countries and fought each other.
What happened was the Marxists had an enormous disillusionment when the French and the Germans and the British workers all rose up for the fatherland and went to war happily, fighting one another.
Marx's idea was a total failure. Workers were more loyal to their respective countries, churches, and cultural values than they were to their counterparts in other countries.
They did not want to give up their houses, their cars, their stoves, their products. They did not want to have a classless society. They did not vote, and they didn't even have an overthrow.
Some years after Marx failed, several of his disciples got a new idea on how to take over the world. One of his disciples, Antonio Gramsci, while where else but in prison, wrote up a series of plans, now known as the Prison Notebooks. In this plan, Gramsci announced, "The workers of the world will unite only after the Long March is over." The Long March?
In other words, they had to get into the culture and change the way of people's thinking. And if people were thinking about patriotism and nation and God and country, that was a mechanism which was too resistant to Marxism. It could never take hold. So you had to erode and destroy that in the individuals. That began what's called the Long March through the institutions, through the seminaries, through the churches, through the media, through Hollywood, and all the rest of it, to create an anti-Christian culture which would destroy the Christian beliefs and convictions in the vast majority of the people, so they would embrace the ideas of Marxism, and they would embrace the ideas that they had rejected, and they would be open to a takeover, basically, by Marxists. Now, not political Marxists, but cultural Marxists.
Rather than workers uniting and marching into battle, thus seizing power through force, they would make a long march through the institutions. Institutions like the arts, cinema, theater, literature, schools, college, seminaries, newspapers, magazines, and what is now known as radio, TV, and the mass media. Once this march is over, all the barriers to the acceptance of Marxism will have been quietly and systematically removed.
So to get to that point, they said we have to destroy the culture, and what they were talking about was the Christian culture, what we used to call Christendom or Western civilization.
If you can break people away from religious affinities, for example, where they would turn to their community, their religious community, for support and help, or they would turn to Scripture for answers to certain perplexing questions. If they have an affinity to their religion, they might say, well, we're not going to go along with government because it's contrary to my religion. So cultural Marxism would attack religion of all kinds. It doesn't make any difference, because there was another place where people could go other than to the government for support and for answers.
We, the people, will have thus been indoctrinated or brainwashed into seeing the wisdom of Marxism and the folly of capitalism. Thus, the door to socialism and communism will be open, and the door to a constitutional republic closed, because the success of cultural Marxism means the demise of the U.S. Constitution.
The Constitution is a set of principles. It's based ultimately on a moral code, because you go back to the Declaration of Independence. What was the basis for the Declaration of Independence? The law of nature and of nature's God, right? The ultimate moral code. But if you don't follow those principles, if you try, as the expression goes, shave a point off here and there to make a buck, or to be reelected, or if you're a special interest group to get some kind of a government subsidy, then the consequences are going to be, in the long run, deleterious to society as a whole. And there's the difficulty. There are too many people that are thinking in the short term and not applying these principles, which are designed to give us a long-term stability to this system.
Let's back up a moment. How did cultural Marxism get into the United States? Some brief history. In 1923, members of the Marxist Communist Party set up an institute at Frankfurt University in Germany. This institute was named the Institute for Social Research. Later, it would become known as simply the Frankfurt School. These new Marxists, under the direction of Max Horkheimer, had seen the old Lenin Marxists fail. The workers of the world did not unite in World War I. Further, they realized why. Antonio Gramsci, the disciple who wrote the prison notebooks, had it right. Marxism could only flourish after a long march through the cultural institutions. Now the mantra would be, change Western culture, and then the workers will unite.
After Marx, there were a group of Marxists who wisely decided that you could bring this collectivist society to a nation through culture as well, by introducing certain values and concepts that would break down the family, for example. If you could somehow break down the family unit so that it was no longer self-sustaining and no longer valued in a society, then that would leave individual members who formerly could turn to the family for support in times of need. They would now be cut loose. They would be without a place to go in times of need. So now they have to turn to the government.
But just as the march through the institutions was about to begin, an anti-Marxist, anti-Semitic Adolf Hitler ascended to power, and World War II began. Since the leading lights of the Frankfurt School were Marxist, the school packed up its ideology and fled to America, settling down in New York City with the support of Columbia University.
Now, if you ever wanted to really piss off Andrew Jackson, all he had to do was mention Rachel's name in vain, and he would challenge you to a duel.
But what exactly is the march? And who was marching? What values has the long march through the institutions rolled over? How have Americans been affected? Let's hear it from some of the Frankfurt School graduates themselves, like George Lukács, Antonio Gramsci, Charles Reich, Herbert Marcuse, Theodor Adorno, Erich Fromm, Wilhelm Reich, and Max Horkheimer.
Marx got it all wrong. The workers are not up to being the vanguard of the communist revolution. Let's translate Marxism into cultural terms.
And Herbert Marcuse.
The West is guilty of genocidal crimes against every civilization and culture it has encountered. America and Western civilization are the world's greatest repositories of racism, sexism, nativism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, fascism, and Nazism. American society is oppressive, evil, and undeserving of loyalty.
Go ahead.
Question 25. What is cultural Marxism?
Well, you picked right up on it, huh? Yeah. Well, this is a very complex subject, but the perceived failure of the Marxists in preventing the German Social Democrats, frankly, from going. This is pretty complex, but a number of Marxists and Leninists believed that the workers at the beginning of World War II would rise up and say, we're not going to fight fellow workers.
George Lukács.
I see the revolutionary destruction of society as the one and only solution. A worldwide overturning of values cannot take place without the annihilation of the old values and the creation of the new ones by the revolution.
Lukács' gift to America later became known as cultural terrorism. Gifts such as radical sex education in public schools, covering such subjects as free love, outdatedness of monogamy, irrelevance of religion, and the archaic nature of the middle-class family. Women were called upon to rebel against the sexual mores of the day, such being the core values of Christianity and Western culture. His ideas later became the basis for the sexual revolution, embraced by a generation of drug-challenged baby boomers.
When you hear people say, as I did on the campaigns, Pat, what happened to the country we grew up in? Physically, it's the same country, but they're right. We're in another country now. And this is why I think the cultural Marxists have prevailed and are prevailing. They have captured the young. What was the saying in the Abbie Hoffman? We're going to capture your children. In a lot of ways, they did.
Although Gramsci died in 1937, his prison notebooks lived on as the blueprints to de-Christianize the West.
The civilized world has been thoroughly saturated with Christianity for 2,000 years. Any country grounded in Judeo-Christian values cannot, therefore, be overthrown until those roots are cut. But to cut the roots, to change culture, a long march through the institutions is necessary. Only then will power fall into our laps like ripened fruit.
And the new generation of freedom-loving, authority-challenged baby boomers were quite willing to accept the bait and take a toke.
Turn on, tune in, drop out.
Yes, our prison planner, Antonio Gramsci, had quite a dream. The only way a Marxist revolution could be successful was if the heat shield of capitalism, Christianity, were first destroyed. Charles Reich.
There is a revolution coming. It will not be like revolutions of the past. It will originate with the individual, with culture, and it will change the political structure only as its final act.
Reich thus helped shape the minds of the American 60s youth with his runaway best-selling book, The Greening of America. Gramsci and Marx were now reaching their target audience, and the long march was in progress.
In the 1960s, the church pulled back from the culture. You had the first Sex and Satanism film. You had the first X-rated film where the pastor takes the boy up to his room in Broadway to get on his knees but not to pray. You had all of the perversion. You went from 100% broad audience films that anybody could see to 82% R-rated movies, which were restricted. You had a tremendous loss of viewership at the movie theaters. Even though television had been around for 20 years, you went from 44 million weekly attendance to 17 million weekly attendance. And so basically what happened, the church gave up in the mid-60s. It gave up on prayer in schools. It gave up on being a force in society. And Johnson shackled the church when he said that when he used the 501c3 to say the churches couldn't talk about politics, and the church just buckled under. When prayer was taken out of school, the church buckled under. When the church collapsed from Hollywood, they buckled under. So it was the church's internal collapse, and that has happened before in history, and unless people get revival, reformation, renewal, we will never reclaim the culture.
So cultural Marxism would be that type of activity in any society that breaks down the culture in such a way so that people instinctively turn to government as an alternative for the support that they otherwise would have. This is done through art, it's through music, it's through literature, it's through motion pictures and that kind of thing. It's the implanting of certain ideas and concepts which make them very ripe for the philosophy of collectivism and makes them very ripe for turning to government as the big daddy, the big solver of all problems.
As Hudson Institute scholar John Fonte wrote, Max Horkheimer and Gramsci believed that there are no absolute moral standards that are universally true for all human beings outside a particular historical context. In other words, to the Frankfurt School, values come from society or the state collective.
Same? Yes. It's relativism.
Collectivism implies that if something is important enough, then the state should step in and make sure that everybody conforms, whether they want to or not. So the essence of collectivism in a political sense is that it employs the use of coercion to require people to work together. And once coercion enters, then you are actually participating in a negative social conduct, which is in many cases worse than the social condition that you're trying to overcome by the collective action. People are not given free will. They're required to do this and that because the majority has decided this is for the greater good of the greater number and so forth. Whereas individualism works toward the same goals, but they do so in the environment of freedom. So it's the difference between freedom and coercion.
Not to be outdone by Karl Marx, a brilliant mind or two at the Frankfurt School soon came up with several of their own ideas, the foremost known as critical theory. The idea behind critical theory is to challenge all previously accepted standards in every aspect of life from a Marxist perspective. Standards such as Abe Lincoln was honest, home is where the heart is, democracy and capitalism are good, the founders believed in freedom. In doing this, every negative thing one could possibly say about America was dredged up, circulated in books, movies, TV, schools, colleges, and even the clergy, so that the youth would be endlessly indoctrinated. Things like white men killed the Indians, fathers were repressive, God is dead, the founders had slaves.
They did have a problem, which was that although slavery was technically legal throughout all the colonies, only some of the colonies really had slave-based economies. The southern states, Maryland, South, essentially. And therefore they had to deal with the practical problem of how could you integrate these states with the northern and middle colonies, middle states and northern states, in a way that would, as much as possible, unify them. So they had to make some kind of initial political compromises with the social institutions that existed in the southern states. But there was a mindset at the time that slavery would essentially wither away because it was not a practical economic concern in the long run. But it certainly was not a matter that could be criticized from the point of view of principle. You know, the first principle in the preamble is to create a more perfect union. That was their first goal.
But when the consciousness-challenged baby boomers repeatedly heard that the establishment, as they came to refer to it, was a bunch of racist, overly religious, sexually deprived sexists who were xenophobic Indian killers and anti-Semites, they internalized the criticisms. Soon their movies and songs began to reflect these values, spreading them throughout the nation's youth culture. Critical theory was doing its job, especially on people like Charles Manson and John Lennon. Even though the reality-challenged baby boomers of the 1960s were the most free, most affluent, and most privileged of any youth in any age, they were bored with their lives and swallowed the Frankfurt School's propaganda like a hit of California Sunshine. Books like The Death of the Family, Escape from Freedom, The Mass Psychology of Fascism, The Sexual Revolution, The Joy of Sex, and The Authoritarian Personality flew off the shelves. Counterculture drug movies like The Trip, Easy Rider, The Wild Angels, The Wild Bunch, and Born Loser played theaters endlessly. Books like Authoritarian Personality were particular hits because they attacked the patriarchal family unit, a deeply Christian institution. So along came movies depicting the family unit as sexually repressed and dysfunctional. Movies like Battle of the Sexes, How to Handle Your Wife, Harold and Maude, The Graduate, Bonnie and Clyde, Carnal Knowledge, Bob and Ted and Carol and Alice, Boys in the Band, The Godfather, and Kramer versus Kramer instilled cultural pessimism about families.
The basic unit of a family is where a male as a sex joins with a female as a sex, and they're able to work together to help each other. And by being able to work together to help each other, they perfect each other, they love each other, they care for each other. And in the process, they learn to love and perfect and care for others within the society. They become good citizens because they're good citizens within their own home, and that produces a society that loves each other. Marriage is a particularly Judeo-Christian institution. It was Jesus who instituted one man and one wife forever shall become one flesh.
By targeting the family unit, the cultural Marxists knew they could eventually destroy the middle class of the United States. Why? Because the family unit is the basic building block of the middle class. Destroy the middle class, and you eventually destroy the economic engine of the United States. Destroy the economic engine of the U.S. and its political structure, built on capitalism and the Constitution, crumbles.
I just recently had some shares stolen from me on the stock market by our government, who seized 80% of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac shares. I'm like, how could this happen? They seized, private property.
The whole point of a socialistic society is to do four things. Marx talks about destroying the family, 2, destroying property, 3, destroying religion, and 4, destroying the nation. And what you end up with is the Gulag, where the whole country becomes the Soviet Union.
Yes, critical theory is diabolical genius. The cultural Marxist could accomplish what Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin only dreamed of accomplishing. Whereas Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin took Marx's ideas and delivered the brutal Soviet Union to the world, Gramsci, Lukács, and Marcuse took Marx's ideas and delivered user-friendly cultural Marxism to America.
The Supreme Court has been converted into a fighting ally of secularism in the wars against traditionalism in the United States. The Supreme Court has perverted the Constitution. It has usurped power that belongs to the states and imposed secular views and values on the states and on the communities, making decisions that used to be made democratically at the local level.
This time it seems Marx won. Today, post-Engel, politically correct baby boomers are so completely immersed in the Frankfurt School's cultural pessimism, they can't see the forest for the trees. They're fish in a bowl of muddy water. They're Neo in the Matrix. They swim in it. They absorb it through every pore of their beingness. Starting in the 1960s, cultural Marxism has woven its values into every American's very existence. Khrushchev was right when he said, "We will bury you." The nefarious genius of cultural Marxist strategy is to destroy the family unit by promoting what's known in the field of botany as androgyny. From the American College Dictionary, androgyny means, quote, having staminate and pistillate flowers in the same inflorescence, being both male and female, hermaphroditic, end quote. Translated into cultural Marxist strategy, this means making the father and mother of a family the same, and or reversing their roles. How is this done? Well, it starts with invalidation.
I hate this house, and I don't want to be here anymore.
As previously discussed, one of the key technologies of the Frankfurt School is critical theory. Recall the purpose of critical theory is to instill cultural pessimism. Thus, by endlessly portraying fathers as dominant, restrictive, depersonalized, and controlling, the cultural Marxist is able to invalidate the male component of the family unit. Concomitant with this, by endlessly portraying mothers as schizophrenic, nagging, anxious, the cultural Marxist is able to invalidate the female component of the family unit. This two-punch invalidation, endlessly repeated in the general literature, movies, and media, gives rise to a pessimistic attitude towards the traditional family. After time, this pessimism becomes imbued into the culture. That's why it's said the product of critical theory is cultural pessimism. The message of cultural pessimism. 1. Families are boring, stifling, and intrusive. 2. Mothers and fathers suck. 3. Divorce is therefore understandable and justified. With divorce made understandable and justified, even laughingly made easy by calling it no fault, 1 out of 2 nuclear families now disintegrate into chaos.
Most contracts, the court system tries to sustain the contract. If you and I are doing business together and they're trying to protect that contract because the contract was entered into in good faith for good principles. However, although the marriage might have been entered into in good faith, by breaking that, they can put a lot of people to work. Not only the marital courts can go to work, there are also the social workers that go to work. There's also a whole team of people, including the IRS, who prey off of them. And one court in Massachusetts says, we're going to bring this father to his knees and take all of his money from him. So there's a whole movement by the courts to make money off the dissolution of marriage.
After the mother and the father are finally done arguing or negotiating over custody of the children and possession of the assets, 2 new family homes are usually established. He lives here and she lives there. Each new household economy now has to have a redundant, otherwise superfluous set of rent or mortgage payments, energy and utility demands, and household furnishings and accoutrements. Extensive and complex scheduling of child visitation then must be established. If the divorce was acrimonious and/or the children were traumatized by it, and most are, both parents vie for the children's attention and visitation. As they do this, knowingly or unknowingly, they spoil the children with unending material gifts, junk food, sugar, unearned validation, and parental supervision so lenient it borders on gross negligence.
Divorce is dreadful for children, and now you have some families, probably the weakest and the poorest, mostly black families, that are now over 50 and even 60% in divorce, which is critical for the children.
But worst of all, children are usually shipped off to daycare centers and/or public schools, where they are then handled like animals in captivity.
Now we're talking about a school system that's teaching values that's determined not by the parents, not even by the teachers, but by the political groups that provide the funding, the politicians, the bureaucrats, the think tanks, all these invisible structures above. Now, those are the people who are determining the values that are being taught in our schools.
The profligate cultural Marxist society that causes and tolerates this then imposes pharmaceutical drugs on these children.
Certainly the arts have always had a tendency to promote license instead of liberty. The difference between license means that I can do anything, even if it's destructive of other people and of myself. I can take drugs until I OD. I can hurt other people and hurt their children and families. License is something that is selfishness rules. With liberty, what rules is the freedom to be responsible, the freedom to live a decent life, the freedom to love others, the freedom to give. It's like the difference between love and lust. And unfortunately, often the principle of love is replaced in the media with the principle of lust. And the lust principle produces media that's constantly pushing the envelope.
Almost every movie that Hollywood puts out today must depict characters with at least one of the following attributes. 1. The protagonist and/or the antagonist are divorced. 2. The female is portrayed as dominant, controlling, violent, and/or one-up on men. 3. The male is portrayed as aloof, feminine, overly sensitive, and/or cheating. 4. Somewhere in the family, at least one of its immediate members must be a lesbian, gay, bisexual, or a women's liber. Often, attributes are mixed in various proportions, and even mixed with a touch of schizophrenia, as males and females swap roles in fluorescence.
Same-sex marriage does not give you the balance of having a mother and a father so that you can learn different skills from them and you learn different personality types from them. By abolishing that, children are adrift.
Through endless repetition and media dissemination, androgynous elements are institutionalized as legitimate and eventually normal. Cultural pessimism has been taken to a whole new level. Complete tolerance for dysfunctional social structures and inefficient economic units. Proof that Christian values do not work.
Schools should be completely operated by parents. They should be in control, and therefore the parents can determine what values are taught to the students. If the school doesn't teach the values that that parent wants taught to their children, then they can take the child out of that school and put him in another school which does teach those values.
The Supreme Court has been converted into a fighting ally of secularism in the wars against traditionalism in the United States.
With the success of cultural Marxism, hundreds of millions of nuclear families have been destroyed since 1965. This has contributed to or caused the decline of the middle class. Next will be the destruction of American capitalism, unless the effects of cultural Marxism are recognized and handled.
There is a revolution coming. It will not be like revolutions of the past. It will originate with the individual and with culture, and it will change the political structure only as its final act.
It's evident today that corporations raise and spend huge amounts of money on the political campaigns of presidents and congressmen. These corporations also spend huge amounts of money hiring former government officials to lobby Congress to pass laws that mainly benefit their interests. If so, have we allowed entities other than people to monopolize government?
The Founding Fathers were very concerned about the use of political power to benefit special interest groups, what they call factions. Small segments of society that had their own selfish concerns that didn't relate to the benefit of others. So they wanted as much as possible to restrain the ability of the general government to engage in that kind of behavior.
The system that we have today of interventionism serves the interests of the lobbyists, and they represent the international corporations because they have influence. And they say what we need is lobbying reform to keep the lobbyists from lobbying. That is not the answer, because lobbying is just petitioning the government, and we have a right to do that. What we have to do, there's two answers to that. One, if you had the right people in Washington, the right members of Congress who would not yield to the temptation of being influenced by money, the whole program would cease. They wouldn't have any more influence. But that doesn't seem to happen. The real solution is getting the government out of the business of being able to pass out favors, so there's no incentive for the businessman to come and lobby the member of Congress.
Have we allowed corporate power to influence the creation of laws that fail to benefit the people? Are we allowing corporations to reconfigure the laws of this nation to suit their purposes at the expense of real people?
Do you feel special interests have hijacked Congress?
I don't. No, I think they've got a valuable part to play because they are experts in their area, and they can provide some good guidance for the congressmen who aren't specialists in these areas.
Lawyers will argue that indeed corporations are people. They will argue that they are even good corporate citizens. But is a corporation really a citizen? Or for that matter, even a person? And what about a multinational corporation? Is that even a citizen of the United States?
There's no doubt in my mind that the political apparatus of the United States government is much more beholden to the powerful lobbying interests, the companies that can write those big fat checks, campaign contributions and that sort of thing. You can see it every day. The politicians will give speeches, very good speeches in some cases, saying all the things that the voters want to hear. But then when it comes time to vote on an issue, they quite often will go directly opposite to what they said, and they will vote in favor of the positions that the corporations want and the lobbyists want.
Did the Founding Fathers write the Constitution for real flesh and blood people or for corporations, artificial entities that are creations of the state? If one suspects the Constitution was written with real people in mind, then is it fair to those real people that artificial people get to write and influence the passage of all manner of laws, and expect these laws to be binding upon those same real flesh and blood people?
Public officials have become less concerned with what people want or with what Americans, the common American, thinks. What's the solution? Well, what kind of a government is this? It's a self-government. Self-government is not a spectator sport. If people don't participate in it, either running for office themselves or becoming involved with political campaigns or becoming involved with public education on issues, well, then you're going to leave by default control in the hands of the small number of people who do those things. And the smaller that group becomes, and the more they see that the general population is really disinterested or even impotent in political affairs, the more they will tend to think, well, we can run things our own way. We don't have to remain in touch with the people because they don't count.
Just as Marxism called for workers of the world to unite, a different totalitarian ideology calls for corporations of the world to unite. Not only unite with each other, consolidation, but unite with governments, with states. Thus, when corporations unite with the state, it is known as fascism. So, what is the difference between a socialist state and a fascist state?
If you go far enough to the right, you get fascism. If you go far enough to the left, you get Marxism.
Fascism develops when the state initiates the merger of corporate power with state power, as what happened in Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy. The key words being merge and power. Fascism is thus not a merger of the state and corporations per se. It's a merger of their power. Secondly, it's the merged power that governs, not either the state or the corporations per se. Today, however, with multinational corporations growing into entities, some larger than states, we have emerging a totally unprecedented form of fascism, what could be called corporate fascism.
Have you ever heard of corporate fascism? If so, what is it?
I'm not familiar with that term specifically. I could take a guess at it, where I assume that it reflects on the amount of money that's available for large corporations to support lobbying and have an influence on what laws are passed and not passed.
Under corporate fascism, corporations are so huge that they have the financial ability to initiate powerful lobbying influences over governments, even the Congress and presidency of the United States. Thus, even though such multinationals and the U.S. states are able to remain distinct, again, it's their merged power that increasingly supersedes the will of we the people.
Have you ever heard of corporate fascism? If so, what is it?
I've read about it on CNN. I don't know if I can actually define it. If I had to say, corporate fascism is probably just greed, corporate greed, and just hypocrisy.
To understand what socialism is, one must first understand what communism is. Communism is an economic system whereby the state owns the means of production. Means of production meaning capital. Capital meaning money, machinery, labor, land, and resources. Socialism is an economic system whereby the state owns the fruits of production. Fruits of production meaning revenues generated by the means. Revenues generated by the means is another way of saying taxes.
Extreme of socialism was the Soviet system, communism. So there was no pricing structure, and it's a failed system. It can't work because prices are so important.
So communism owns and confiscates the means and fruits of production, whereas socialism confiscates just the fruits of production in the form of excessive taxes. Socialist states in Europe, for instance, confiscate as much as 50% of the money citizens pay for retail products and services. This is the outrageous sales tax a socialist state demands.
We interfere a lot, but we allow prices to adjust in the marketplace for the most part. But when it comes to interest rates, the Federal Reserve is always deciding the central plan through the control of money and interest rates, how much money we should have in circulation, and should we shrink the money supply, expand the money supply. And that's a form of socialism, but it's only half of socialism because it's controlling only half of the transaction, and that's money. But it's very dangerous and leads to an authoritarian approach because it eventually breaks down, and I think that's what we're witnessing today.
Thus, a socialist state rapes the people mainly through excessive taxes. A fascist state rapes the people, mainly through excessive debt. Both ultimately rape the people through taxes, because debt causes inflation, a hidden tax. Debt causes inflation because the Federal Reserve System facilitates the conversion of government bonds, government IOUs, into Federal Reserve notes, what we use as a currency.
Well, the Federal Reserve, in its very nature, is contrary to a free market. The Federal Reserve is not only regulating, but it's manipulating the marketplace against the will of the people who are conducting the marketplace.
When this is done, the money supply is inflated. When the money supply is inflated, it becomes watered down or diluted. Just like stock, when a corporation authorizes and issues more stock, existing shareholders are diluted. When money is diluted, it has less purchasing power. When it has less purchasing power, prices rise because it takes more Federal Reserve notes to purchase a given product. When prices rise, it has the effect of a tax. Inflation is therefore a hidden tax.
If the government can create new money that it doesn't have to tax for, and especially if it can put off the ultimate payment of this into the future through the use of long-term bonds that are the backing for the fiat currency, then we have a government that is essentially out of control to some degree. It can make decisions that are not immediately going to subject the people to pressure.
Thus, corporate fascism uses debt, which generates the hidden tax of inflation, and cultural Marxism uses endless taxes to fund its socialist operations and expansion. Unfortunately, the constitutional republic envisioned by the founders is being undermined by both cultural Marxism and corporate fascism. And to blame our problems exclusively on either the left or the right, liberals or conservatives, Democrats or Republicans, is foolish. Again, both cultural Marxism, an ultra-liberal ideology, and corporate fascism are undermining the U.S. Constitution and destroying the republic envisioned by the founders. As we have seen, the Constitution gives Congress the power and the responsibility to provide for the general welfare of the nation. So important is the idea of general welfare. This is the only term that is stated twice in the Constitution, once in the preamble and again in Article 1. Unfortunately, a lot of people interpret this term to be a green light for massive social security, the so-called nanny state, which pays for everything and then demands the right to regulate everything.
Well, the Constitution was written to limit the size and scope of government. It was to recognize that government was there to protect our liberties. It does not endorse the welfare system at all. If we just followed the Constitution, the government would be very much smaller, maybe 80% smaller.
This may be the cultural Marxist's dream of a socialist state. But as a result, we now have minimum wage laws, child labor laws, federal disability laws, Medicaid laws, public housing laws, rent laws, entitlement laws, food stamp laws, and even extensive pet laws. Over 25,000 laws are enacted every year, many by congressmen that have been bought and paid for by multinational corporations, all non-people entities.
I hereby declare this to be an unlawful assembly. If you remain in this immediate vicinity, you will be in violation of the Pennsylvania Crimes Code, no matter what your purpose is.
What comes to mind is big corporations that put their view of the world out there for everyone, take over small businesses, take over choices that people might have, different kinds of products where everything becomes much more generic and just based on cost as opposed to quality and workmanship.
Because term limits have not been established for the Congress, most congressmen have been able to stay in office for decades.
Again, this is the Supreme Court. States were enacting and imposed term limits on their members of Congress in something like half the American states, and the Supreme Court overthrew it and took the right away from the states to impose term limits on their own members of Congress. And what did Congress do? They said, it's fine with us, because we'll stay in power.
It seems the more a congressman is entrenched, the more he is able to build a social network, a network of cronies. Clearly, good relationships with fellow congressmen serve many productive purposes, but such a network can also be abused. After all, it's much easier to minimize the risks of vote swapping, a form of collusion, amongst cronies. It's much easier to justify corporate campaign contributions, a form of bribery, amongst cronies. And it's much easier to get away with earmarks, a form of fraud, amongst cronies. Thus, an entrenched Congress, especially one cast into only two major political parties, would seem to be in the perfect position to imperceptibly usurp power from the people and place it into the hands of the corporate fascists that have hijacked Congress.
The right place to look for a solution to the problem of corrupt politicians is at the voter and their perception of who they're voting for and what the political principles of their candidates are.
You can bet collusion, bribery, and fraud are not practices the founders envisioned for a more perfect union.
So unless I have this view that I need to participate in this system as a self-governing citizen to maintain the integrity of the system will eventually be dominated from the top down by the people who can actually make something from gaming it, as the expression goes. So this is the Founding Fathers' point. It depends upon having a virtuous citizenry that is willing to shoulder the burdens of maintaining a self-governmental structure.
Again, general welfare includes everyone, especially the vast majority of average citizens who fall within the middle of the social spectrum. In statistical terms, the average, or mean, is represented at the top, or crest, of what's known as a bell-shaped curve. It's the middle of the bell-shaped curve. So it's fair to say that the original intent of the Constitution is to define a government that serves the general population, the middle of the bell-shaped curve, now known as the middle class.
Do you sense a dwindling middle class or a wealth disparity?
Well, I think things are changing right now. I think the last 8 years have been increasing wealth disparity, but I think some of the excesses of those days may be over.
The terms spreading the wealth, redistribution, and wealth disparity are meaningless in an America that truly responds to the original intent of the Constitution.
The proper function of government is not to provide, but to protect. Because if you're going to provide for some, you must have the authority and the power to take from others. And once you're in that business of taking from some and giving to others, now you're in the business of redividing the wealth. And that gives you tremendous power over the citizenry. And it always leads to abuse of power and eventually to totalitarian regimes.
Many have commented that we now have a monstrous tax system, a system that taxes its citizens far more than citizens of the Boston Tea Party era.
If 2 to 3% taxation justified a revolution in 1776, why doesn't 50% and growing justify a revolution? If a few little excise taxes on pieces of paper and tea justified open lawlessness from these rebels that we're all celebrating, why don't the myriad of incomprehensible, unavoidable, crushing taxes state, local, and federal, why don't they justify a revolution today?
Our government not only taxes us at every transaction, it's in our faces at every turn, endlessly regulating what we can and cannot do. All these regulating laws and their expensive enforcement programs are turning us into a police state.
People like us, you have brothers, sisters, uncles, we're all family. Why harm your own brothers and sisters standing here today who peacefully want to assemble? Why? Why not sound like a weapon on us? We have done nothing wrong. We have not broken any laws. We mean no harm to you. We don't want to hurt you. We don't want to attack you. We want to stand here as Americans because we know our founding fathers died for this very right.
We are the policemen of the world. So instead of a government now that occupies so many other countries, and we have 700 bases overseas, that wouldn't happen if we had the proper size government.
Over 50% of U.S. citizens now work for the government at either the federal, state, or local level.
Obey your orders! Understand the orders you are taking right now are unconstitutional. Yes. Understand right now what you guys are doing here today will play effect throughout history. The Germans, listen to their orders. The Germans violated their civil rights, God-given rights in Nazi Germany in the 30s by simply listening to unconstitutional orders and not questioning authority. We are here because we mean no harm to you. We are tired of these private Federal Reserve bankers who are running this country and destroying this country from the inside. The tyranny that they committed against you.
Before the Romans crashed and burned, they had gone down the same road, only they called their Social Security bread and circuses. Bread and circuses will eventually crash the U.S. empire as well, if we interpret the term general welfare in the Constitution as an invitation for Social Security.
General is the problem.
What did the Founding Fathers intend when they wrote those words?
General welfare has been debated since the Constitution itself. Many of the founders were concerned that general welfare would be taken in the wrong sense, that it would be used to apply for, as we've done it today, as Hamilton wanted us to do it, to give the government license to do whatever it wanted and just to grab power.
The founders knew that Rome, and every society since the beginning of time, had poor, sick, and unfortunates. And many of these societies tried to help. For instance, in 1597, England had the Elizabethan Poor Laws enacted to provide what were known as the 7 corporeal works of mercy. These works were to feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, welcome the stranger, clothe the naked, attend the sick, visit the prisoner, and bury the dead. But is this how you really promote the general welfare, the founders asked?
You're talking to someone about a free society, and they say to you, as they always do, what about the poor? Oh, the poor. What are we going to do about the poor if there's no welfare state? The poor that die in the streets and isn't that, right? A perfectly valid objection, and we all generally have this tendency. What do? We run out and we research, and we become the human Wikipedia talking point planet of infinite facts. And we try and give everybody statistics, and we give everybody historical examples, and we say, well, there was these friendly societies in the 1920s, and the fact that I find useful is the number of poor people after the Second World War was declining 1% a year because of the free market. When the welfare state came in, it stopped declining and stayed steady, which is exactly what you would expect. And if you subsidize something, you increase its prevalence, and you subsidize poverty, you get more.
Give a man a fish, and you feed him for a day. Teach him how to fish, and you feed him for life. The founders were teachers. Their original intent was to set up a system that created fishermen.
The Constitution means what the founders intended it to mean. Otherwise, it means nothing. If you want to have the Constitution mean what modern politicians think it should mean, then you don't need a constitution. In fact, you're better off without one. Just say, what do the modern politicians want us to do today?
What would happen if you created a society that could actually rise above problems? A society where the government gently facilitated a free and prosperous citizenry. A citizenry so successful there were no hungry. There were no sick or poor. There were no criminals.
You could take the Department of Education, the Department of Housing, and any number of these national departments and defund them to zero and send out the funds to the states in block grants, which would eventually go down to zero, and get rid of most of the federal government. The federal government still has a responsibility of national defense. The Justice Department is needed, the State Department is needed, the Treasury Department are needed, but many of those other departments should be defunded rather than have the politics of the federal government imposed upon the nation.
The founders wanted to set people free from the system, or the matrix. That's what liberty is all about. They wanted general welfare to be the result of a self-governing, productive society. They wanted general welfare, not welfare in general. One of the earliest examples of corporate fascism can be found in the current U.S. banking system. This system, known as the Federal Reserve System, or Fed, is a quasi-private, government-sanctioned banking cartel, little different from OPEC or any other cartel. Just as OPEC dictates the amount and price of oil, the Federal Reserve dictates the amount and price of money. Hardly what one could call free enterprise capitalism.
Federal Reserve, in its very nature, is contrary to a free market. The Federal Reserve is not only regulating, but it's manipulating the marketplace against the will of the people who are conducting the marketplace. So the Federal Reserve is a drain and also a detriment to a free market system.
By setting interest rates and determining the amount of money in circulation, the Federal Reserve epitomizes regulation of what's supposed to be a free market capitalist society. This cartel presents the illusion of working for the general welfare, but in reality, it always acts in the best interests of not only itself, but its prime lenders and borrowers, the U.S. government, the major New York banks, and the multinational corporations. With this unlimited balance sheet, the Fed can effectively create as much money as it wants to satisfy Congress's wayward spending habits. This money, known as legal tender, is money not backed by gold, but created by mere government fiat, and now mandated as payment for all debts, public and private. Known as fiat currency, this so-called money is regulated not by the free market, but by a Federal Reserve Open Market Committee that deliberates in secrecy. It is the Federal Reserve System that is at the heart of endless bailouts and the too-big-to-fail syndrome, a system that creates endless amounts of money that fuels wars and the fascist globalist agenda by basically two mechanisms: monetizing debt and fractional reserve.
The gold and silver standard the United States had was an enormous blessing for this country.
Today, the U.S. currency is backed by nothing but debt in the form of U.S. bonds. This is known as monetizing debt, the act of converting debt into money. Debt causes inflation because the Federal Reserve System facilitates the conversion of government bonds, government IOUs, into Federal Reserve notes, what we use as a currency. When this is done, the money supply is inflated. When the money supply is inflated, it becomes watered down or diluted. Just like stock, when a corporation authorizes and issues more stock, existing shareholders are diluted. When money is diluted, it has less purchasing power. When it has less purchasing power, prices rise because it takes more Federal Reserve notes to purchase a given product. When prices rise, it has the effect of a tax. Inflation is therefore a hidden tax.
If you can delay the payment and hide the payment, that is, borrow money or print money, those who really pay the price are hard to find. They're usually the poor people in the middle class. So it's a very specific plan to have a central bank to destroy money. It's been done for thousands of years. They used to dilute the metals or clip the coins, or even in the old days they tried printing money. Today we do it with a computer.
Thus, corporate fascism uses debt, which generates the hidden tax of inflation, and cultural Marxism uses endless taxes to fund its socialist operations and expansion. Unfortunately, the constitutional republic envisioned by the founders is being undermined by both cultural Marxism and corporate fascism. And to blame our problems exclusively on either the left or the right, liberals or conservatives, Democrats or Republicans, is foolish. Again, both cultural Marxism and corporate fascism are undermining the U.S. Constitution and destroying the republic envisioned by the founders.
As far as fractional reserve banking is concerned, that's a problem of fraud. That is, fractional reserve banking is where the bank generates more paper currency than it has, say, gold and silver reserves on a specie standard. And it can really generate as much paper currency as the market is willing to bear, as long as the market has some credence that the bank will pay. And what tends to happen is that the banks overexpand. They play too many of those cards, and at a certain stage the market says, no, there's too much money out here in terms of real resources, and you get what's called a bank run. People come back to the banks and will make good on these promises. The banks can't do it. You have recession, depression, what have you, the whole credit structure drops. Now, if that kind of a system were fully disclosed and everyone knew how it was working, my anticipation is that there would be very few fractional reserve banks.
The framers of the Constitution were quite aware of the liabilities of bills of credit and fractional reserve banking. And this is why Article 1 states, "No state shall make anything but gold and silver a tender in the payment of debts." And, quote, "No state shall emit bills of credit."
The Federal Reserve System should be abolished. It was not authorized in the Constitution, therefore we shouldn't have it. But I take a sort of a moderate approach to doing it because there's a lot of people who depend on the system today, and I wouldn't close it down in one day, but I would legalize competition, allow gold and silver to circulate as money, take taxes off gold and silver so you didn't have to pay sales taxes or capital gains taxes, and let the people transition over to gold and silver. Since 1976, we weren't even allowed to own gold. And then later on, we got the American Gold Eagle. So we're moving in that direction, but we need to go a little bit further to legalize contracts in gold. The real culprit is the ability of the Fed to monetize debt. Members of Congress spend money for war and welfare. They can't borrow enough and they can't tax enough, so they literally create treasury bills out of thin air, and then the Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air and buys the treasury bills, and that has to eventually destroy the value of the dollar.
If we were to abolish the Federal Reserve System tomorrow and get the banks out of it completely, turn the entire function as it now operates over to the Treasury, nothing would change. The same people would still dominate the system from behind the scenes. So this question of ownership receives too much attention, because where that idea goes is that, well, if we can just find out who owns these banks, and if we don't like who they are, then we can support a move to abolish the Federal Reserve and turn that system over to the Treasury. exactly as it's now operating. So the focus should not be on who owns the banks, but on what the banks are doing.
If the public better understood how fiat money can be abused by Congress, it would impeach almost every member and abolish the Federal Reserve Central Bank, as it has done twice in the nation's history. Given the events of the day, it's easy to see we have wandered from the original intent of the Founding Fathers. As a result, it seems our wayfaring government has converted us from a modest republic into a global empire. As a consequence, the empire requires vast sums to operate at home and abroad.
The trouble is every empire, whether you're talking about Rome or the Soviet Union, it's all based on the enslavement of humanity. And however well structured it is and however powerful it seems at any given time, that will only last so long. And I think people are starting to catch glimpses of the fact that that's true about the United States too. When everybody said, oh, it'll be around forever, it won't, because basically the tyrants who run the show and have been playing the game played it too far, as they always do, and will be collapsing their own game. It's nice that it always goes that way, that eventually every empire collapses and gives humanity basically another chance to try freedom.
Some spent at home satisfy the cultural Marxist agenda of the nanny state. Some spent abroad satisfy the corporate fascist agenda of the multinationals. Is it thus any wonder the national debt is now well over $10 trillion? How can we do this?
Do you feel the federal government has grown too big?
No, I do not. I feel that it's probably not big enough given the problems that we have right now. I think it should probably be bigger.
Ben Franklin might have answered this question by saying that Americans are too good-hearted. As a result, we have been overly generous to the poor and overly accommodating to the rich. All the while, we have failed to provide for the engine that keeps America strong, the middle class, those neither rich or poor. If the general welfare of the nation were high, there would be no need to tax the rich in order to provide for the poor. If the general welfare of the nation were high, there would be no need to help the poor, because they would be on their way to becoming rich.
Do you feel the federal government has grown too big?
Yes, I do, and I think it's continuing to get too big.
National debt is too high. And of course we were paying it down until things took a U-turn somewhere about 8 years ago.
The government has definitely become out of touch with we the people, because the government has now grown so much power. Right now there was an article today in the New York Times that 1 out of every $6 that people earn are from the government. There was a couple of months ago in the Wall Street Journal, there was an article that at least 40% of the people, and I can't remember the exact percentage, are some way tied on the government dole. As soon as this comes, we just become part of the government plantation. We are slaves to the government. We need the government. We are dependent upon the government for our livelihood, and the government no longer has to listen to us, because they know if we have a complaint, they can just pull some of our money, some of our resources, remove some of our handouts, and we're suddenly left in the lurch.
We are fast on our way to becoming a socialist nation, similar to the former Soviet Union. A Marxist government where 100% of the citizens were employed by the state. At the same time, we are spending almost $500 billion a year on the military, more than the combined spending of the next 25 nations.
I think we do spend too much on the military, but not enough on social programs.
We spend 4% of our gross national product on national defense, and we're committed to defend half of the world. You can't do that. We are facing imperial overstretch. That's what happened to the British Empire, and 10 years of war showed that the British Empire was overstretched, and it collapsed totally.
Eisenhower was dead right about the military-industrial complex. What more can you say than that? Just look around you, and there you see it everywhere.
As earlier discussed, lobbyists that flow money to keep certain congressmen in power have configured our laws in such a way they now benefit multinational corporations more than they benefit we the people.
These used to be American companies. There were great names, famous names, Boeing, General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, GE, and others, and they're still great companies. But they're no longer strictly American companies. They're global companies. And what they want to do is produce at the cheapest price they possibly can. And where are they going to get the cheapest workers? They're going to get them in Latin America, in Mexico, in the Far East, and in China. So what these multinational companies are now doing is they are transferring their plants and their factories and their technology over where production is cheapest and maintaining completely free access to the consumers in the United States. What the transnational companies profit from is basically by getting rid of their American workers, but keeping their American consumers. And in this sense, they no longer have any kind of a loyalty to the community where they were raised, or to the states, or to the country.
There is a revolution coming. It will not be like revolutions of the past.
At our peril, we ignore the advice given to us by Jefferson and Washington when they warned us about getting involved in entangling relations around the world. We are giving billions away in foreign aid to governments that are involved in conflicts. And when we do this, it involves us in their conflicts.
President Washington said, "We can trust to temporary alliances in times of necessity." Between 1778, when we had our alliance with France, which lapsed in 1800, and 1949, the United States never entered an alliance with any other country. Then we established NATO as a defensive alliance against the Soviet Empire, and we drew a red line across Germany. That was a temporary necessity in the Cold War. When the Cold War ended, the United States should have reviewed all of its treaty commitments to Japan and Korea and Taiwan and Europe and all over the world, and abrogated or dissolved all the alliances that no longer serve the vital national interest of the United States.
The Constitution doesn't give the federal government the right to form any alliances like that, where we give our sovereignty to these sort of supernatural national bodies. You know, now I basically say that there is no point for it. It's basically to expend our interventionism and to protect our empire.
Because of the conflicts we have now become entangled in, we have over 800 military bases and outposts stationed in over 130 countries around the world. To maintain this infrastructure, we have to spend almost $500 billion a year. Some say $1 trillion a year when you factor in debt service and long-term medical care for veterans.
We are facing imperial overstretch. That's what happened to the British Empire. And 10 years of war showed that the British Empire was overstretched, and it collapsed totally after World War II. The United States should simply shed these commitments to fight all over the world on behalf of nations which have nothing to do with the vital interest of the United States.
In an attempt to optimize the world stage for capitalism in the name of spreading democracy,
if America doesn't stand up for the cause of freedom, who will, Carl?
We have, over the past 50 years, resorted to both overt and covert operations.
The Bush Doctrine is open-ended. It is, we cannot be secure unless the world is democratic, and we have a right to interfere in the internal affairs of every country on earth to make them democratic. It is an absurdity. We are undertaking an assignment we cannot fulfill. It is endless. It is a formula for perpetual war, for perpetual peace.
It is clear by failing to follow the original intent of the Constitution, we, the people, have allowed the rogue politicians that now infest Congress, the Supreme Court, and the executive to involve us in endless wars, hence endless debt. We spend endless amounts of money into the military-industrial complex, which Eisenhower warned us about. Yet all we seem to get in return is perpetual war.
The very wise and wealthy financiers of the world, going way back, even before Rothschild's time, have observed that the world was a pretty rotten place to live in. That nations were always fighting over something or other. Somebody was always trying to conquer somebody else, and wars were universal. Too bad about that, but that's the way it is. So we found out, that we bankers, that if we loan money to them, that we get paid back. They don't question what the interest rate is because they're fighting a war. And if they can win the war, they can just plunder the victim and pay us whatever we want out of the plunder. It doesn't cost them anything, really. Then the issue comes up, well, what happens if one of these nations decides not to pay us? The answer is very simple. If they refuse to pay us back, we'll finance an opposing nation or a revolutionary group somewhere else to become an enemy of that nation and attack it and destroy it, invade it. We'll create another war, in other words, in order to get our money back. We'll finance this side to attack that side. And so by financing all sides in a war and keeping the world divided up into warring factions so that no one unit is particularly stronger than the other, the banks can continue to finance all sides of wars forever and always collect their interest because they have the ability of putting one nation against another nation to collect their debts.
The military and banking beasts we have allowed to flourish and prosper are eating up money we could be placing towards rejuvenating the school system, the healthcare system, maintaining bridges, roads, and levees, developing fusion, solar, and ethanol energy technologies, allowing savings and capital formation to reduce the cost of products, and providing better-paying jobs for the middle class. Many of our actions and foreign policies have been beneficial and delivered in a good American spirit. However, we have also allowed our government to do some nasty and selfish things, as John Baker explains in his article, Blowback: The Cost and Consequences of American Foreign Policy.
Blowback is a term whereby you take an action abroad, such as we overthrew the Mossadegh in 1953 in Iran, and blowback came when the Shah we installed was overthrown in 1979 by nationalistic forces, and we got a worse situation than we had.
We have in the past supported questionable rulers that have turned against us, such as Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. The IMF World Bank, which is heavily funded by fiat money created by the U.S. Federal Reserve System, lends money to subprime borrowers in third world nations. And then, when they inevitably default on their loans, the U.S., through corporate agents, forces concessions known as structured settlements on such countries. Concessions include granting the U.S. sweetheart deals on natural resources, such as oil, profit participation in their public utilities, certain voting patterns at the UN, land for yet more U.S. military bases, and free access to canals, such as the Panama Canal. When countries don't play ball with the U.S. empire, the empire strikes back. We send in the military, as was the case with Iraq.
I do believe that Iraq is the greatest strategic blunder, certainly in my lifetime, because we attacked and invaded a country that did not threaten us, did not want war with us, and really and did not have the weapons of mass destruction we said it had. It was an utterly unnecessary war. It has cost 4,000 American dead, 33,000 wounded, $600–700 billion on the way to trillions of dollars. It has antagonized and alienated the entire Arab and Islamic world. I think it has helped to break the Bush presidency, and I can't think of any gain worthwhile that we have gotten as a consequence of this war. This war could be the beginning of the end of the United States as a superpower and as the lone superpower on Earth.
I have to say that most wars in our modern age, in my view, are unjust because they're being fought over reasons which are not honestly stated. They're being fought over hidden agendas. But we must keep in mind that there is a theoretical basis for a just defensive war. And in a defensive war, if somebody's trying to attack us and take over our country, truly do, not something that our political leaders have created this myth about, but really is truly happening, then we would gain by winning that war. Because if we didn't win it, we would lose our freedom.
The mere fact that we are involved in so many unethical and entangling relationships the world over makes it inevitable that we will cause severe antagonism and perpetual war. Such antagonism has precipitated blowback in the form of attacks on our embassies, ships, and buildings. September 11th, 2001 was the most dramatic example.
9/11 was indeed blowback for massive American intervention in the Middle East, supporting Saudi Arabia, putting our troops in there, the Iraq War, and aiding the overthrow of the Afghans. In effect, it came back to bite us. The 9/11 terrorists were over here because we are over there.
By projecting our military to secure oil in Iraq and Saudi Arabia, rather than securing the blessings of liberty, we are causing conflict that is destroying domestic tranquility. Oh, it's easy to blame it all on the Democrats or the Republicans or even the Islamic radicals. But as Harry Truman said, the buck stops here. The buck stops with we the people, and how well we self-govern pursuant to the U.S. Constitution. In short, by allowing our elected officials to receive campaign contributions from corporate entities, all non-people, we are causing all these bad things to happen because such elected officials cannot possibly be true to both the U.S. Constitution and the fascist agenda of globalization. Governments, including our own, will always seek excuses to expand, and war is one of the primary tools a government uses to expand its power.
World War I, did that provide a net gain? It destroyed one of the most stable international structures the world had seen throughout history. It brought about the Bolshevik Revolution, it brought about the Nazi Revolution, it brought about World War Depression, it brought about World War II. So we'd say certainly it was not a net gain that came out of World War I. It's hard to see the net gain really that came out of World War II. Hitler was defeated and you ended up with Stalin with more power than Hitler ever had. The Japanese were defeated, you end up with Mao Zedong in control of China.
War is the health of the state, according to author Randolph Bourne. It's up to we the people to maintain our health by keeping our government under good control. We the people ordained and established the Constitution of the United States of America in order to ensure domestic tranquility, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity.
The United States is the greatest nation on earth. We have coexisted with monarchies, with despotisms, with dictatorships. We have been the most secure nation on earth. And we maintain our security by maintaining strong, powerful military forces to defend and protect us, and the will to fight in our vital national interests, and letting the world know that, and staying out of wars that are none of our business. That's how we survived in the 20th century as the one great power to enter the 20th century that left it still a great power. What happened to the British Empire, the French Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Hohenzollern Empire, all the rest of them, the Japanese Empire, all smashed, all destroyed, because they were overextended and they got into wars that carried them too far and were none of their business. That is where we're headed right now with these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and plotting war on Iran and all the rest. It is not essential to our vital security, and we ought not to be doing it.
The only way this can be done is for we the people to read and understand the U.S. Constitution, as well as the underlying philosophy behind it, and insist that the people we vote into office apply it to the letter, not just give it lip service. Anyone who doesn't believe this has no right to call themselves an American citizen or a representative of we the people. Like the Federal Reserve System, the Congress has been further distorting the letter of its constitutional responsibilities by delegating its power to declare war to another entity, in this case, the President.
One of the great problems the country faces is the cowardice of the Congress of the United States as an institution. It has allowed the President to usurp the war-making power.
Where does Congress get authority to delegate the responsibility to declare war to the President? It's not in the Constitution. This delegation sounds more like an evasion of responsibility for political expediency than the original intent of the founders.
It has resigned its authority. It is frightened of exercising its authority. It does not want responsibility. It does not want accountability.
Article 1, Section 8 clearly states, Congress shall have power to declare war, to raise and support armies, to provide and maintain a navy, to provide for calling forth the militia.
People such as George Washington, Nathaniel Greene, the leaders of the Army, didn't think much of the militia. The militia came for 30, 60, 90, 180 days, and then when their enlistment time ran out, they went home. They didn't have to stay. They came with sort of an oddment of firearms. Typically, they were firearms that didn't entirely fit the Army pattern. They had different calibers, logistics problems arose. The men weren't clearly not as well trained as the regular soldiers. They had a tendency to break when the British charged them with bayonets, for instance. So people like Washington, who was obviously very influential at the time, didn't have a particularly good word to say about the militia. So one would have thought when the Constitution was drafted, the Founding Fathers would have left the militia out. We don't need this. Hadn't proven to be that effective. Or they might have said, well, Congress or the states can set up a militia if they want to, but it's discretionary. Depends on circumstances. They did the exact opposite. They recognized the existence of what they called the militia of the several states at the time. It's constitutionally recognized. And then the Second Amendment comes along and says it's necessary to the security of a free state. So I would say the Constitution makes it absolutely clear that those entities, because there's not one entity, that should be one in every one of the states, is a key structural element of the Constitution. And why? Well, it's because ultimately, who's the militia? It's the people.
With every shooting on a college campus, the cultural Marxist indoctrinating mainstream media never mentions the true source of the problem, the disintegration of the family unit. Instead, the media pushes the socialist agenda of removing citizens' Second Amendment rights.
Let's go to the Second Amendment, which says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Just take the first clause. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. Stop right there. That's the only place in the Constitution where the Constitution says that anything is necessary for any reason. The Constitution doesn't say Congress is necessary, the President is necessary, the Supreme Court is necessary. It doesn't even say the states are necessary. It says a well-regulated militia is necessary to what? To the security. Well, not just any kind of security, but the security of a free state. And that's the sole purpose of the Constitution in toto.
The way that the United States was set up originally was that the defense of the nation was to be primarily the responsibility of the states. They were to create militia drawn upon able-bodied American citizens within the state. They were to provide their weapons and their training and their leaders. They were to form into a national fighting force, and they would defend the borders of the United States against foreign enemies. But the primary foundation, the element of that, was the militia.
Never stated in movies like Bowling for Columbine, movies funded by cultural Marxist-infiltrated Hollywood studios, is the original intent of the founders that all citizens retain the right to keep and bear arms. More accurately, the obligation to keep and bear arms as part of the militia.
The Michigan militia wanted everyone to know that they were nothing like McVeigh and Nichols.
This is an American tradition. It's an American responsibility to be armed.
I'm sure you guys are the kind of people that people would like to have as their neighbor.
As the Constitution tells us, a well-regulated militia is necessary to the security of a free state. Now, some people may disagree with that, and my response is, well, that's a personal opinion. The law is otherwise. Right? The law tells us that this is the principle on which we're supposed to be operating. You don't like that, amend it. If it's there, enforce it. If you don't enforce it, there will be some consequence, because the Constitution is, how shall I put this? It's an integrated document in the sense that all of the parts were designed to function with all of the others simultaneously. And if you look at it, there are several pillars to it. There's, of course, the federal government, the Congress, President, and the Supreme Court. There are the states. There are the people as electors. And then there's this group of entities called the militia. And read the Constitution through and you'll see they're essentially all on an equal plane. They all fit into this structure. Well, if an architect designs a building with 5 support columns, it's probably because he believes every one of those is necessary. You knock one of those out or you allow it to decay, and you can pretty much expect that that building is not going to be stable over the long term. Certain kinds of shocks affect it, it's going to come down. Same thing with a governmental structure. Governmental structure was designed in such a way that the people were supposed to play an important role in maintaining political power of military force.
Instead, the Frankfurt School's agenda of injecting cultural pessimism into society continues. Robberies, murder, fires, and now escalating school shootings all contribute to the cultural pessimism and the misguided justification of disarming the citizens. But if citizens ever allow cultural Marxists, such as the Michael Moores of the world, to ban ownership of guns, they will make a grave mistake.
These guys that created the American Constitution, the American Republic, were looking into the future, and they were concerned about our own government becoming despotic. They could see that. They talked about the possibility of that. How do we prevent that from happening was a major issue of discussion. And they said one of the ways is to make sure that we don't give them a standing army, and the other way is to make sure that the local population was armed. Because if you've got every man, able-bodied man in the country, and women too, armed and knowing how to use a weapon and under training and with their local squad leaders and so forth, their own commanders, there's no government that's in the United States that's going to turn against them. So they were very wise. And today, people laugh at that concept, but now that we're losing our liberties, I think the laughter is dying down pretty rapidly.
By order of the City of Pittsburgh Chief Police, I hereby declare this to be an unlawful assembly. I order all those assembled to immediately disperse. You must leave the immediate vicinity. If you remain in this immediate vicinity, you will be in violation of the Pennsylvania Crimes Code. If you do not disperse, you may be arrested and/or subject to other police action. I order all those assembled to immediately disperse. You must leave the immediate vicinity. If you remain in this immediate vicinity, you will be in violation of the Pennsylvania Crimes Code, no matter what your purpose is.
Observing thousands of years of history of earlier governments, the founders knew that the only thing that ultimately stands between a tyrannical government and the people are weapons.
Quoting Mao Zedong, who in this case agrees with the Second Amendment, political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. Where the source of political power is to be is where the gun is. Ultimately, that's the bottom line of force in government, right? That's what government is, the application of force. If the application of force is given to some elite group, they're in control. If the application of force is given to the people, they're in control. If you want a free state, a self-governing state where we the people do the ordaining and establishing, who has to control the ultimate body of force? It's the people themselves. And that's not a professional army. That's not a standing army. That's something the Founding Fathers were very much concerned about. They didn't want a standing army.
It thought that a standing army was perhaps one of the most dangerous things you could imagine, because if Washington, D.C., they said if they were to have a standing army, you know what they're going to do with it? They're going to use it. They're going to use it for something. If you get a bunch of soldiers sitting around training, you're going to use them. And they didn't want that, except in a defensive mode.
If people read the Constitution, that it's not in a time of war you have a standing army. When there's no war, you have to abolish the standing army within 18 months. You can have a navy, but no standing army.
Also, never forget the instrument that literally authorized the U.S. Constitution and freed all Americans from oppressive European rule was the Declaration of Independence. This sister document states that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of certain ends, such as the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it is the duty of the people to alter or abolish it. Alter it means to vote out those who aren't following the Constitution. If such politicians, over time, or unbeknownst to the people, reconfigure the government in such a way as to usurp the rights of the people, then the only choice left is to abolish the government.
So they were acting within the law when they stood on that green, and they believed that General Gage was outside the law. He was an outlaw, that regular army. And that's why they didn't throw down their arms that day. And they opened fire on him.
Now, one doesn't like to think of that as being something that we want to face here in this country. But there are many other problems prior to that that the militia would deal with. And a large militia structure would have a terrific deterrent effect on any people in political life that had aspirations to become usurpers or tyrants. It's pretty hard to overcome a country when 60 or 70% of the people are organized, armed, and trained.
The Second Amendment states that the people, as and through their militia, have the right to keep and bear arms, and this right shall not be infringed.
As individuals have rights, and we grant the government privileges. Those privileges are listed in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, and anytime we have a justifiable reason and the courage to do so, we can revoke those rights and take those privileges away from the government.
This means that a well-regulated militia consisting of the people, not some distant bunch of federal professionals, has the right to keep and bear, meaning own and keep on their person, guns and arms, short for armaments. These armaments are for use should the people, through their constitutional militia, find it necessary to abolish a tyrannical and suppressive government and replace it with a serving government that promotes the general welfare and secures the blessings of liberty. There are a lot of factors connected with our drift away from constitutional principles. Among these, the most debilitating is our banking system, the Federal Reserve. Even though the Fed was created by an act of Congress in 1913, its operation and relationship with the U.S. government is amorphous, if not completely nebulous to the public. Some claim this is by design, for the Fed conveniently operates as a close partner when Congress needs to borrow yet more money, but an independent agency when it's convenient to insulate itself from political fallout or its part in precipitating recessions. Thus, in 1913, Congress delegated its duty to manage the money supply to a bunch of elite New York bankers who formed a banking cartel now known as the Federal Reserve System. When the Federal Reserve System was planned in 1910, it was done so without the full knowledge and consent of the people. Born in secrecy on an island off the coast of Georgia, elite bankers of the time sought to establish a central bank that would mimic European banks and ultimately give them complete control over the nation's money.
The Federal Reserve is technically owned by the member banks, so we know who owns the Federal Reserve, the member banks. But who owns the member banks is very difficult, if not impossible, to find out, because the member banks are not registered with any government agency. They're not corporations. They have the basic structure of a partnership or something very private. It may even be something unique, but it's not on the public record. And the owners or the partners of these banks are not about to let it be known. Now, it's true that you can buy stock in Chase Manhattan and all that sort of thing. You can buy stock in the Bank of America, and as a stockholder you're listed. But the true control and ownership is not on the public record. And it's easy to hide that. You can use street names, you can use Swiss accounts, you can have corporations holding stock for other corporations which are holding stock for other corporations and that sort of thing. In general, it's possible to completely conceal the controlling interest of the banks from the public.
From 1913 to 1971, the elite Federal Reserve bankers managed to slowly decouple the nation's currency from the gold and silver backing required by the Constitution. In 1971, the Fed cartel finally got Richard M. Nixon to disconnect the last vestiges of gold from money on the pretense that the British and French were redeeming too many of their Federal Reserve notes for gold, something people and countries are supposed to do when Congress and bankers print up too many Federal Reserve notes.
But when you went off the gold standard, finally, when we cut it loose in 1971, when I was in Nixon's White House, and the reason we went off the gold standard totally, was that all these dollars that we had poured out in the United States had gone abroad, and the British were coming in with our dollars demanding gold at $35 an ounce or $42 an ounce. They would have cleaned us out. So Nixon shut the gold window.
Now that the bond between gold and paper money has finally been broken, over the period of 1913 to 1971, the elite bankers print up as much fiat currency as Congress demands for all manner of welfare and warfare purposes.
Of course, anybody who likes big government, whether it's for the welfare state or for warfare, do not like the restraints of a gold standard, because then governments would have to pay for everything. They'd have to tax the people. And if the people were taxed today for all the welfare and all the warfare, all of it would end.
The relationship between fiat money and wars is direct and immediate. Wars at the scale that we know them in the modern world would simply not be possible, and they would not happen if it weren't possible for the nations who are waging those wars to raise the money from their population through the hidden tax called inflation. Inflation is caused by the Federal Reserve System, through fiat money, the creation of money out of nothing. So, if it were not for fiat money, most of the wars that we've known in recent times simply would not have been fought on either side.
Ultimately, all the money that is used to stimulate, rescue, or bail out corporate entities that are too big to fail comes from the Federal Reserve System's power to create money out of thin air, also known as monetized debt, as more fully covered in the movie Fiat Empire. The 2008 Bear Stearns, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, AIG, and $700 billion Wall Street bailout, root cause fiat money, not subprime lending, as Treasury Secretary Paulson claimed, are only the most recent examples. Other bailouts in past decades have been Penn Central Railroad, 1970, Lockheed, 1970, New York City, 1975, Chrysler, 1978, Commonwealth Bank, 1972, First Pennsylvania Bank, 1979, Chicago Continental Bank, 1982, and the entire U.S. savings and loan system in the 1980s. The Federal Reserve System makes all this moral hazard possible. Even though the original intent of the founders was for Congress to be the most prominent branch of our government, today's congressmen are shirking this responsibility. They do this by improper delegation of their duties and responsibilities to outside agencies, committees, other branches of government, and even private entities. Why? So they can avoid blame for such things as bailouts and wars and stay in office as long as possible. To the degree they can get the courts or the president to decide on the tough issues, they can avoid making unpopular choices that could get them voted out. Money is the primary touchy issue because money represents the energy of the citizens. Yes, people are very concerned about their wages, credit, stocks, and money. Given this, what could be more relevant than Article 1, Section 8, which states, Congress shall have power to coin money and regulate its value. Section 10 then goes on to say that no state shall emit bills of credit, or make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts. The meaning is clear. Gold and silver, when coined, are the only things that are money. Regulate its value? What does this mean? It means Congress is charged with the responsibility to run a quality control check on all weights and measures, which allow money to be counted, thus valued. How can you ethically value money unless you can ethically count it? That said, most people don't realize that a dollar is a unit of weight, like a pound or an ounce or a ton. In the U.S., a dollar is the unit of weight of pure precious metal in coin form. Thus, $1 of silver weighs 0.77 troy ounces. In the early 1900s, $1 of gold weighed 0.048 troy ounces. Given the real definition of the word dollar, it's easy to see what the Constitution is talking about when it charges Congress with the responsibility of maintaining the value of a dollar in terms of honest weights and measures. But today, people, and even Congress, misinterpret the original intent of Article 1 in other ways. They think it's Congress's job to maintain the value of the dollar by adjusting interest rates or adjusting the money supply, what's known as an elastic currency. An elastic currency is blatantly illegal per Article 1. Congress has no authority to allow the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee to adjust interest rates. Only the free market has the authority to adjust interest rates through the billions of individual transactions made by hundreds of millions of citizens. Thus, the cost of money, the interest rate, should be valued by the free market, not the Federal Reserve System.
They can fix these prices of gold to dollar and pretend they're not inflating and fudge the figures on the CPI and the PPI, but eventually the market understands it. So even in a system like the Soviet system, there was always a black market, and the black market is the real market. So the more government you get, the more black market you get in order to figure things out. But it does take a while to sort all that out. But long term, the market is smarter than all the regulators and all the planners there are in the government.
Free market capitalism means regulation by the free market, not by the government. So long as the Fed regulates the money, it is impossible to have free market capitalism, because money is the only commodity that represents every product and service in the economy. To regulate money is to regulate every product and service in the economy. Thus, to scream for more regulation when the economy melts down, or to chastise Alan Greenspan for his free market ideology, is a straw argument.
Dr. Greenspan, I'm going to interrupt you. The question I have for you is, you had an ideology, you had a belief that that free, competitive, and this is your statement, I do have an ideology. My judgment is that free, competitive markets are by far the unrivaled way to organize economies. We've tried regulation, none meaningfully worked. That was your quote. You had the authority to prevent irresponsible lending practices that led to the subprime mortgage crisis. You were advised to do so by many others, and now our whole economy is paying its price. You feel that your ideology pushed you to make decisions that you wish you had not made. In other words, you found that your view of the world, your ideology was not right. It was not working.
Precisely. No, that's precisely the reason I was shocked, because I've been going for 40 years or more with very considerable evidence that it was working exceptionally well.
Since no free market has ever existed in the U.S. since 1913, the year the highly regulating Federal Reserve System was established, it is foolish to blame the 2008 credit crunch or stock market meltdown on a lack of regulation. Totalitarians do this only to further their globalist agenda and destroy the idea of a real free market capitalism.
The gold standard, in my judgment, is the right standard to have. The problem with it is this. There is no gold standard which is going to bind politicians and prevent them from creating dollars. As they create the dollars to pay for wars and other things, then people realize that the dollars aren't that valuable and they come for the gold. And in other words, politicians will inflate the currency regardless of a gold standard. And we have found that gold standards collapse because politicians do things to make it to collapse.
But you can't print up gold or silver. Gold and silver take human effort to acquire. Thus, the supply of money can be regulated by the price of gold and silver in the free market. On the other hand, money based on paper with no ties to gold or silver can be endlessly printed up, thus regulated not by the free market, but misregulated by the state. With this kind of money, bills of credit, the government can print up as much money as it wants, thus watering down everyone else's money. We call this loss of purchasing power when it happens, and it has happened plenty. It now takes 100 pennies to buy what only 5 pennies could buy back in 1913, the year the Federal Reserve System was established.
Where does Congress get most of its funding?
I would like to say from us, but I'm sure they have foreign investors that they also get their money from.
They print it.
And can you elaborate on that?
They have no funding. They have no money. It's all puff and mirrors. They have no money. It's all an illusion. There's not much in back of it.
The dollar has just gone down precipitously, much faster now. So the dollar of 1913 probably is worth about 3 cents today. And even today it's going down rapidly. So as the dollar lost its backing, slowly but steadily between 1913 and 1971, government did grow. But since 1971, all you have to do is look at the total obligations of the government financially, the debt that has been accumulated, the powers accrued to the government, and they keep growing.
Ironic that Alan Greenspan, before he was co-opted as chairman of the banking cartel, wrote, quote, "In the absence of a gold standard, there is no way to protect savings from confiscation through inflation. There is no safe store of value." End quote. Today, judging from his book, The Age of Turbulence, Alan Greenspan seems to believe in free markets for every product, service, and commodity, except for the one commodity that's most universal: the cost of money. That is, interest rates. Whereas the free market should regulate everyone else, only the Open Market Committee at the Federal Reserve should regulate the cost and amount of money. And this regulated money should be forced on American citizens.
You should have free market principles apply not only within the marketplace of cars and gadgets and widgets and whatever else, so that the good will survive, so that people can do good and do better, so that the best will, so competition can produce a healthy environment where people keep improving their product, but you should have the free market within banking.
So, how did we go so wrong? Why is America now a post-industrial nation with an export profile similar to a 19th century third world colony? Let's take a look at how the institutionalization of cultural Marxism and the greed of multinational corporate fascists have caused we the people to undervalue the very Constitution upon which the American experiment depends. When the Cold War ended with the collapse of Marx's workers' paradise, the Soviet Union, the United States suddenly found itself the only superpower.
At the beginning of the 20th century, there were about 5 great empires: the British Empire, the French Empire, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Russian Empire. And you might add the Ottoman, and 2 great nations, Japan and the United States. And Japan became an empire. The end of the First World War saw the collapse of the Russian Empire, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and the rise of Hitler and Stalin and Mussolini and Lenin. And the Second World War brought the collapse of the British Empire and the French Empire and all the lesser empires, the Portuguese and the Dutch and the Belgian.
All reduced to dust because all dissipated their blood and treasure in perpetual wars.
Wars are the killers of empires. And the United States survived as the greatest country in the world for a single simple reason. We were the last great power to enter both world wars after most of the bloodshed had been done. American soldiers did not arrive in France in great numbers in the battles until the spring and summer of 1918, 6 months before the war ended. We went into Normandy 11 months before the end of a war which was a 6-year war for the British. So the United States stayed out of the great wars until most of the bloodletting, or an awful lot of the bloodletting, was done. And we came in at the end, sort of like Fortinbras at the end of Hamlet.
Unfortunate for the members of the Frankfurt School, the original intent of the U.S. founders was clear and effective. Stay out of wars. Don't squander the Republic's blood and treasure. Make no permanent alliances. All traditional values.
War is tolerated. In fact, war is even applauded in many cases because people are of the impression that it is to the benefit of their nation. People tolerate or applaud war if they think it's a defensive war. If they think that they're defending themselves against a dreaded enemy, you would certainly tolerate a war, you would applaud it. The object is to convince the people of all nations, including those that are doing the attacking, to convince the population that their war is really a war of defense. They have to create in the minds of their people an image of a terrible enemy out there. And the reason they're attacking the enemy is because if they don't, he's going to attack them first. So it's a question of who gets the first shot.
From the ratification of the Constitution to World War I, Hamilton's vision guided the nation and inoculated it against the immorality of cultural Marxism and the greed of corporate fascism. What is Hamilton's vision? What Hamilton was saying was a nation's political independence is dependent upon its economic independence. Washington shared this vision with Hamilton because what they wanted to do was wean the Republic off a reliance on foreign trade so Americans would never again be drawn into wars of the old continent. The only way to do this, Hamilton reasoned, was to erect protective tariffs, a price of admission for foreign countries to have access to American markets.
The word protection is in virtually every Republican platform from 1884 to 1948. And the protectionist period in American history, which can fairly be called from about 1860 to 1928, was the most productive in the history of the United States or of the world. At the end of that period, we manufactured 42% of the world's goods.
The purpose for these tariffs was to stimulate our own people to build factories and finance a strong central government, which, at the time, was needed. A strategic goal enabling the people of the U.S. to be able to cut bonds of dependency upon foreign nations and create bonds of commerce amongst themselves. Further, when a nation puts a tariff on foreign goods coming into the country, it is more able to cut taxes on goods produced inside the country. But today, this is known as protectionism, a dirty word with the corporate fascists behind monopoly capitalism, media consolidation, and non-citizen multinationals that have purchased Congress.
I believe a trade policy should be crafted to protect the sovereignty of the nation, the economic independence of the nation, and the standard of living of the American worker. Our present trade laws are designed to protect the freedom of transnational corporations to abandon their country, to desert their workers, and to go abroad in search of the highest immediate profits at the expense of the community and the nation that nurtured them.
Free trade is supposed to mean simply no tariffs on either imported or exported goods between countries. A tariff is another word for a tax. By using the word free, the corporate elite makes free trade seem good. After all, anything that's free is good, right? While Americans buy over 45% of China's exports, China buys less than 3% of our exports. The corporate fascists pushing globalization call this free trade. But is this fair trade? Let's take a closer look at the implications of this term, free trade, and see how high U.S. corporate taxes, European VAT tax rebates, and World Trade Organization rules conspire to make trade between the U.S. and the rest of the world anything but free.
The European Union is gaming the system against the United States. For example, when we had corporate tax rates which are relatively equal, that would be a fair trade situation. Europe has cut its tax rates, average tax rates, corporations down to 24%. Ours are 40%. That gives them an advantage. How do they make up the money? They impose value-added tax on American imports of 15% coming into Europe and rebate the tax to European corporations exporting to the United States. This has the effect of a Smoot-Hawley tariff against the United States of America. And it is the reason why we run annual massive trade deficits with Europe.
But that's not even the worst damage the corporate fascists' so-called free trade has caused. In 1993, a massive free trade bill was ushered through Congress. This trade bill was known as NAFTA, short for North American Free Trade Agreement.
What happens when you set up a free trade zone, as Hamilton set up in the United States, with the 13 states all becoming one common market, what happens is that a central government has to rise above it to enforce the laws and regulations. Hamilton set that up, and what rose out of that was the mighty American government. When the Europeans had the European Union, they made it initially a common market, a free trade zone. Gradually, this enormous government rose up of the European Union that now sits in Brussels, which is becoming a continental-wide government, and the states are losing their sovereignty and independence. If you have a global economy, then you're going to need some kind of political organization to manage and control it and enforce its rules. The beginnings of the world government already exist in the World Trade Organization, the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, the new International Environmental Authority, Kyoto. All of these things are the embryonic institutions of a world government.
There definitely is a plan to consolidate the United States, Mexico, and Canada. It's more than a plan. The beginning stages already are well underway. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing depends on the type of government that will be created. If we had the type of constitutional republic that we were given by our forefathers, if that were in place today, and if that were the concept of the kind of a government that we were going to use in the merger of Canada and Mexico with the United States, I think it would have a lot to be said for it. I would probably be in favor of it. But that is not what's happening today. What is happening today is the merger of these three countries into a collectivist super-regional government. By collectivist, I mean it will be totalitarian in nature. There will be very little room for individual rights. It'll all be dictated from the top, and it'll be practically a model of what we're now seeing happen in Europe and the European Union.
The North American Union is absolutely being built. We know about the NAFTA superhighways. We know about the trade agreements that are being set up. We've seen a similar model already with the EU. So yeah, I think it's pretty clear.
15 years later, to the joy of cultural Marxists on the extreme left and corporate fascists on the extreme right, the results of NAFTA are in. Heroin, marijuana, and illegal immigrants are pouring in over the U.S.-Mexican border. More than 1 million jobs, once performed in the U.S., are now performed by Mexican workers at Maquiladora plants. Among the major entities that championed NAFTA were the Council on Foreign Relations, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Heritage Foundation, the Brookings Institute, the New Republic, and the National Review. Among those who joined in opposing NAFTA were the following: Ross Perot, Pat Buchanan, Ralph Nader, the AFL-CIO, and the American people. Nevertheless, NAFTA passed. Did Congress care what the American people wanted? Obviously not.
Behind this are basically an international elites, many of whom would like to get control of the wealth and the power of the United States and transfer the decision-making authority for that to transnational governments and global governments. and taking that power and authority away from the American people. You have people in the United States who are anxious to merge this country with Mexico and Canada in sort of a North American Union, and then merge that with the European Union. And above that, who runs that? Just as the elites in Brussels and in Strasbourg are running the European Union, so you would have a global elite running the world economy, and the United States would simply be part of this enormously productive North American province of the global economy and of the world government.
There are groups, many of them I think, that are seeking to establish a new world order, a world government based on the model of collectivism. You can imagine who these people would be. The ones who control others, benefit from a totalitarian system. In other words, politicians like collectivism, because collectivism puts ever-increasing power into their hands. Bankers like collectivism because it gives the banks the power to create money with state sanction and state support, to create money out of nothing, and that gives control over human beings. All of these people work together instinctively, even though they may have separate individual or professional goals. They do work together and support each other toward this ultimate aim of a new world order, is how they like to describe it, which is a totalitarian system based on the model of collectivism.
Indeed, free trade is not free at all. It's the serial killer of the American economy and the Trojan horse of world government. It's the primrose path to the loss of economic independence and national sovereignty the founders warned us about. Free trade is a bright, shining lie made possible by Marxists of the Frankfurt School and fascists of greedy multinationals. By failing to follow the Constitution, Americans have allowed multinational corporations to further their fascist agenda of globalization. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed because a centrally managed Marxist economic system with no pride of ownership simply doesn't work. Concomitant with this collapse, both China and India saw the wisdom of changing their economic policies before they too suffered a similar fate.
400 million Russians and Eastern Europeans who had been behind the Iron Curtain suddenly joined the global economy. And then when China moved toward capitalism, hundreds of millions of more workers basically went into the global economy to compete. And their competitors are American workers and European workers who were making salaries, say, of $30, $40, $50 an hour in manufacturing. And these hard-working people who are quite willing to work for less, they became an enormously attractive labor market for American industries and American factories, which have been moving to China and to Mexico and to third world countries to take advantage of low-wage labor, very little laws and regulations, low taxes, and by so doing, what's happened is the great manufacturing base of the United States has been exported.
Greed-driven Benedict Arnold CEOs were unable to resist the opportunity to fire American workers and exploit people who would work for wages 5 to 20 times less. Thus was born what we now call globalization, the profit-motivated act of exploiting slave labor workforces to produce cheap and unsafe products that can be sold to American consumers until they overextend themselves on credit card and home equity debt. In short, globalization is the daily business of the fascist multinational corporation in its psychopathic pursuit of stockholder value at the expense of human value.
And the winners are the owners of the American corporations whose profits are soaring, and the shareholders, and the losers are first world workers, in particular American workers, who are seeing their wages arrested and their wages fall and their jobs going overseas in the millions for the last 30 years.
If one day I encounter a lady who just bought a toy from Walmart, I'll say, "Respectable customer, respectable Walmart customer, do you know why you can buy such a cheap toy from Walmart? That's because we workers work all day, every day and night."
We added 125,000 new jobs around this world this past year. Good job.
In the 1960s, before cultural Marxism was able to get its foothold on the institutions, American companies, not multinational corporations, produced 96% of all that Americans consumed. Now, a fourth of America's steel is foreign-made, a third of its cars, half of its machine tools, 2/3 of its clothes, and almost all of its shoes, radios, telephones, TVs, cameras, VCRs, and bicycles.
So what these multinational companies are now doing is they are transferring their plants and their factories and their technology over where production is cheapest and maintaining completely free access to the consumers in the United States. What the transnational companies profit from is basically by getting rid of their American workers, but keeping their American consumers. And in this sense, they no longer have any kind of a loyalty to the community where they were raised, or to the states, or to the country.
Between NAFTA and the Federal Reserve System, both gifts to the American people from greedy Wall Street financial institutions and their fascist multinational corporate clients, the U.S. has seen its dollar lose over 95% of its purchasing power, seen its economic and energy independence squandered, seen its major homegrown industries decimated, seen its working men and women forced to submit to employment as debt slaves, seen its middle class placed into Darwinian competition with foreign workers making slave wages at gunpoint. And now it's seen a $700 billion taxpayer bailout of Wall Street banks and financial entities. In one generation, the house that Hamilton built has collapsed. Corporate fascists have been able to hollow out the U.S. manufacturing base and exploit the U.S. market because cultural Marxists have been able to hollow out traditional American values on their march through the institutions.
There have been forces working in this direction for centuries, and they are coming to realize this ideal of theirs. But quite frankly, loyalty to globalism is thus treason to the American Republic.
The Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission, they've been talking about a world government for a long time. They've testified in Congress that they're trying to build a world government. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's pretty laid out on the table. That's what's being done.
The corporate fascist and the cultural Marxist, having similar totalitarian goals, often work together to destroy free market capitalism and the republic the founders built. And this is the idea. Get the public focused on the left-right cockfight so they fail to realize that both the Democrats and the Republicans are serving other masters.
This guy's hate stems from influence that you find on the left not on the right.
This man was a mentally ill, lone wolf, leftist-inspired feminazi?
I would strongly argue that the true political spectrum is nothing that is generally perceived, because of course you have this crazy system where the very left wing is communism and the very right wing is fascism. But those two things are virtually the same. There's a tyranny of corporations and there's a tyranny of the state. On the Republican side, you have those who want to restrict your social freedoms, like drugs and gay marriage or whatever, and they promise you economic freedoms. But when they get into power, all they do is they restrict your political freedoms, your social freedoms, without enhancing your economic freedoms. On the Democrat side, they say, well, maybe we'll legalize marijuana, we're for gay marriage and stuff, so they're more for your social freedoms, but they're going to tax you to the hilt in order to pay for their various programs. When they get into power, what they do is they don't give you more social freedoms, they don't legalize marijuana or whatever. What they do is restrict your economic freedoms even more. So you have this seesaw, each group promising you one aspect of freedom, each group taking away your freedoms on the other side.
Another fallacy that Americans have is that we have this dichotomy in the United States with the Republicans versus the Democrats. That's not a dichotomy. The Democrats want to control us in one way, the Republicans want to control us in another way, but they both want control.
People have used this false dichotomy between, let's say, fascism and communism, corporate socialism and monopoly capitalism, have used these false dichotomies to undermine the truth. At one extreme is totalitarianism. The ultimate form of totalitarianism was communist dictatorship of the proletariat, where Stalin ruled a state that was basically a slave state. Very close to that, though, was the fascist totalitarianism of Hitler. At the other extreme is not more dictatorship. You can't have dictatorships on both extremes, because if dictatorship on both extremes, you have no freedom. The freedom has to be at one extreme, and it goes from freedom to a lack of freedom. Dictatorship is at one end of the scale, and freedom is at the other end of the scale.
Unfortunately, negative influences far worse than left and right have crept in. Not only has the cultural pessimism and the parade through the institutions attacked America's culture, but our banking system has been hit as well. The Federal Reserve, set up by banking architect Paul Warburg, is a European-style central bank, complete with all the inherent problems of the old world. Banking principles diametrically opposed by the founders. Alien concepts, such as backing money by debt instead of gold, lending out more money than you have in the vault, printing up money so banks can stimulate the very economy they just crashed. All this so bankers can charge more for interest and snap up real estate assets with straw buyers in recession markets. Thanks to the Fed, Congress can bypass the public's representatives and wage war with money that has been literally created out of thin air. Are any of these American ways? Did the founders set up the Constitution so Antonio Gramsci, a cultural Marxist from the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, and John Maynard Keynes, an economist indoctrinated in the environment of our former enemy, should stamp their war-torn European philosophies into the very soul of our nation? Something isn't right here.
In Keynesian economics, they endorse the Federal Reserve System. And to print money out of thin air is really fraud, because they're stealing from people, stealing the value from some people. So they're completely different. But Keynesianism is not socialism, but it leads to socialism. Socialism is where the government controls supply and demand and prices and the whole work. But Keynesianism allows the market to function to a degree with a lot of intervention, a lot of regulations, a lot of taxes, a lot of planning, and a lot of inflation.
How can the original intent of the founders shine through when our entire economic system and cultural institutions have been perverted by ideologies of a world we worked so desperately to get away from?
The New Deal like the Great Society and like the universal peace proposals advanced by President Wilson, all of these presidential programs that have expanded the power of government have been the implementation of collectivism in America. Starting at about the time of Woodrow Wilson, the country at that point was pretty much an individualistic country. It was based on the principle of the individual being supreme and the government being the servant of the people. Starting with World War I, starting with Woodrow Wilson, on down through World War II, down through Vietnam War, now to the war on terrorism. All these wars are always used to frighten the American people into accepting the expansion of government, supposedly to protect us against an evil, terrible enemy.
The actual expansion came about through the Supreme Court adding some words to the Commerce Clause. They said Congress has the power to regulate commerce or whatever affects commerce. And that's rather a radical departure from the Constitution, because imagine if you added those words to every other provision of the Constitution. Why shouldn't you? If you can add it to one, you can add it to others. You'd have essentially unlimited government. Well, what that has done is it has given Congress the power to control not only all true commercial activities, but all sorts of things that are entirely local that are related to commercial activities. So, for instance, you had the gun-free schools law. Based upon what theory? Well, a gun goes through commerce and eventually ends up in somebody's hands. And there he's within 1,000 feet of a school, 100 feet of a school, whatever the distance is. And so Congress can regulate his possession at that point in time. Well, his possession at that point in time is not a commercial transaction by any stretch of the imagination. How can Congress regulate it? Well, because this implement that he's holding in his hand at one time moved through commerce. Well, of course, if you follow that theory out, they can control every aspect of your life. How much cornflakes do you eat in the morning? Well, you eat one bowl. Maybe you should only eat half a bowl of cornflakes. Can there be a statute telling you how many cornflakes to eat in the morning? Sure, because where did those cornflakes come from? Well, they came from Battle Creek, Michigan.
The Supreme Court has perverted the Constitution, making decisions that used to be made democratically at the local level. The Congress has the power in the Constitution, Article 3, Section 2, to circumscribe the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court and say, stay out of that area. That is our area, that is the state's area. You are not to get into that. Judges don't decide these issues, people do.
After the formation of the Fed and selling the public on the New Deal, it wasn't long before Congress realized it had both the ability and the philosophical justification to print up endless amounts of elastic currency, what we call fiat money. It also wasn't long before Congress realized it needed more and more money in order to service the growing addiction of socialist benefits under Roosevelt's New Deal, and at the same time build a military machine it could use to spread democracy to the world, as Bush II might say.
The Federal Reserve, when it came in, aggravated all the worst problems of the economy. It's aggravated and caused the Great Depression. It's aggravated and caused the last depression, and it will continue to cause more depression. Before the Federal Reserve, every economic system has ups and downs, but they corrected themselves much more quickly, and they corrected themselves because people had the freedom to shift their attention, to be able to create solutions to the problem, and to be able to exercise their God-given wisdom and intelligence to be able to do business with each other.
Ever wonder why congressmen were so eager to sacrifice tariffs for NAFTA's free trade? It's because tariffs don't amount to much when Congress can print up all the fiat money it wants through the Federal Reserve System. Yes, monetizing endless fiat money was the answer opinion leader economist John Maynard Keynes suggested to Roosevelt in his 1933 open letter. John Maynard Keynes.
I lay overwhelming emphasis on the increase of national purchasing power resulting from governmental expenditure, which is financed by loans and is not merely a transfer through taxation from existing incomes. Nothing else counts in comparison with this.
By these words, Keynes, the most prominent economist of the time, laid out the philosophic rationale for endless government borrowing and endless government spending of fiat money. Roosevelt bit.
And now we're addicted. We're addicted to the programs, and even the banking system is addicted to ever increasing the money supply and artificially manipulating interest rates low. And on the short run, it does seem to help. Just recently, the Fed pumped in $200 billion and the stock market loved it. But in time, when everybody knows they created $200 billion of new money, the value of the dollar goes down, which has happened since then.
Keynes knew exactly what he was doing. No two men did more to destroy the original intent of the founders and set the groundwork for the cultural Marxism and corporate fascism that was to later flourish as competing totalitarian ideologies, hell-bent on destroying a self-governing republic that sought to practice true free market capitalism.
You can go back to a gold standard, say, of $1,000 an ounce. But what do you do if they keep spending and spending and borrowing and borrowing? People suddenly realize that these dollars aren't really worth that much gold, and they will demand the gold.
Sounds to me, given the state of affairs we're in today, well over $10 trillion in debt, immersed in perpetual wars, getting more secular and socialist by the minute, fascist multinationals dominating Congress, that we have allowed serious corruption to seep into the American experiment. We may think we won our independence from Europe, defeated communism and Nazi fascism. But did we?
We have traveled the road to totalitarianism almost to the very end.
Austrian free market economics is really the answer, and that's the system that we should be following. And more or less, even though it was not known at the time our country was founded, it was more or less classical economics and classical liberalism that was very close to what the Austrians teach today.
Tragic that wine-drinking, pot-smoking, Engel-challenged baby boomers would so recklessly thwart the wisdom of the Founding Fathers by allowing their banking system and economy to be so influenced by European financial philosophies. Philosophies that over the past century have created a living hell of endless wars and empires, as we have seen. The intent of the founders was to establish a nation that was different from the ways of Europe, and they did. The United States is different. Not only that, contrary to the propaganda originated by critical theory, it's the greatest nation that has ever existed. America is not a universal nation or a multicultural nation, as CFR globalists writing in Foreign Affairs would have reality-challenged baby boomers believe. It's a distinct nation, distinct with its own language, laws, history, and cultural background. We are different from the rest of the world. So how come the media seems oblivious to all this? The media that's looking out for the folks never discusses fiat currency, cultural Marxism, media consolidation, Keynesian economics, NAFTA, GATT, WTO, or multinational corporations in any sort of critical way? How come the mainstream media downplays people who protest against free trade, the World Trade Organization, or call for protective tariffs?
We do a detailed economic study of the box office called our Report to the Entertainment Industry, where we get the studio heads to come. And the studio heads have been moving toward more movies with faith and values. Every one of the 6 major studios have started a division to do movies with faith and values. Where the most erosion of values and the greatest attack on values is occurring is the independent film market. Independent film, you tend to have a lot of anti-American films, a lot of anti-faith and values, a lot of anti-Christian films, and they do not do well at the box office. Within the television industry, you find more of an attack on faith and values, mainly because the television industry is not focused on the vote. You see, in movies, each person votes for their movie. They know that they have to appeal to who's going to vote for them at the box office. You have to separate out the movie industry, which seems to be moving counter to much of the other media.
How come the mainstream media acts as an apologist for multinational corporations and fails to take a deep look at the endless expansion of government or its secret partnerships with members of the military-industrial banking complex? Instead, all we see is endless programs threatening the world with U.S. military might. Blonde, aggressive women with plastic breasts, and endless TV spots offering insomniacs pills to cure their cheese and dairy product challenged stomachs. Seems to me, to get away with all this cultural Marxist propaganda, the media must be in on the deal, systematically avoiding certain issues, narrowing the spectrum of speech, redefining words, spinning events, and ignoring, invalidating, and/or blackballing any author, filmmaker, or candidate that speaks the truth. Americans and reality-challenged baby boomers need to wake up and smell the Constitution.
The famous quote from Franklin was that after he left the Constitutional Convention, he says, "We've given you a republic if you can keep it." And obviously we haven't done a very good job.
I think if people want to live in a democracy or a republic such as ours, then they're more than free to do so, and we should lead by example, not by force.
Citizens need to get familiar with the original intent of the founders and realize that the forces of cultural Marxism and corporate fascism have been raping and pillaging the United States for decades. But to realize the dream and keep this magnificent republic alive, all Americans need to do is take 3 steps. 1. Disconnect from all sources of cultural Marxist propaganda, media, and lifestyles. 2. Don't patronize the largest Fed member banks and fascist multinational corporations. 3. Connect up with the original intent of the founders and get active applying the U.S. Constitution. Americans and history-challenged baby boomers should understand what it means to be a self-governing nation. They need to understand the Constitution from a philosophical point of view, not just a mechanical point of view. Why were certain things emphasized and others not? Why is a well-regulated militia necessary to the security of a free state? Why is the term general welfare the only term that appears twice? What principles lay behind the Constitution and why? If citizens better understood these things, they would be able to go about their lives with a greater appreciation of the rare opportunity they have been given to live in the American experiment. Instead of pessimism, they would have the realization that America has just begun, that the future will be even more incredible than anyone imagined. Take 3 steps and it will happen. Yes, the cultural Marxists in the media and the universities will scream and dramatize. Yes, the corporate fascists that dominate American industry and global commerce will threaten and flail. Yes, there will be a percentage of religious fanatics that attack the United States or hate us because we flourish and prosper. And yes, there will always be secular robots and iconoclasts that hate traditional values and deny America was populated by Christians or influenced by biblical principles. But the founders somehow knew all this, for they had studied thousands of years of history and countless failed civilizations. From these lessons, they built the Constitution of the United States, and this document has succeeded as no other. The blueprint for the longest-standing republic in history is in your hands. Eventually, even the cultural Marxists, the corporate fascists, the Islamic terrorists, and our current special interest-dominated Congress will see the light and become part of the general welfare. In the meantime, don't give liberty-challenged members of society the power to enslave us all, just because a relative few have so little faith in the original intent of the founders and the United States Constitution.
The Constitution of the United States represents no threat whatsoever to our form of government.